Section 11 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul-Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 11. Parts 110 through 121. 110. Religion, a system to reconcile contradictions by mysteries. Theology might justly be defined the science of contradictions. Every religion is only a system invented to reconcile irreconcilable notions. By the aid of habit and terror, man becomes obstinate in the greatest absurdities, even after they are exposed in the clearest manner. All religions are easily combated, but with difficulty extirpated. Reason avails nothing against custom, which becomes, says the proverb, a second nature. Many persons, in other respects sensible, even after having examined the rotten foundation of their belief, adhere to it in contempt of the most striking arguments. Whenever we complain of religion, its shocking absurdities and impossibilities, we are told that we are not made to understand the truths of religion, that reason goes astray, and is capable of leading us to perdition, and, moreover, that what is folly in the eyes of man is wisdom in the eyes of God, to whom nothing is impossible. In short, to surmount by a single word the most insurmountable difficulties presented on all sides by theology, they get rid of them by saying these are mysteries. 111. Absurdity of all mysteries invented for the interests of priests. What is a mystery? By examining the thing closely, I soon perceive that a mystery is nothing but a contradiction, a palpable absurdity, a manifest impossibility, over which theologians would oblige men humbly to shut their eyes. In a word, a mystery is whatever our spiritual guides cannot explain. It is profitable to the ministers of religion that people understand nothing of what they teach. It is impossible to examine what we do not comprehend. When we do not see, we must suffer ourselves to be led. If religion were clear, priests would find less business. Without mysteries there can be no religion. Mystery is essential to it. A religion void of mysteries would be a contradiction in terms. The God, who serves as the foundation of natural religion, or deism, is himself the greatest of mysteries. 112. Absurdity of all mysteries invented for the interests of priests. Every revealed religion is filled with mysterious dogmas, unintelligible principles, incredible wonders, astonishing recitals, which appear to have been invented solely to confound reason. Every religion announces a hidden God, whose essence is a mystery; consequently, the conduct ascribed to him is no less inconceivable than his essence. The Deity has never spoken only in an enigmatical and mysterious manner, in the various religions which have been founded in different regions of our globe. He has everywhere revealed himself only to announce mysteries, that is, to inform mortals that he intended they should believe contradictions, impossibilities, and things to which they were incapable of affixing any clear ideas. The more mysterious and incredible a religion is, the more power it has to please the imagination of men. The darker a religion is, the more it appears divine, that is, conformable to the nature of a hidden being, of whom they have no ideas. Ignorance prefers the unknown, the hidden, the fabulous, the marvelous, the incredible, or even the terrible, to what is clear, simple, and true. Truth does not operate upon the imagination in so lively a manner as fiction, which, in other respects, every one is able to arrange in his own way. The vulgar like to listen to fables. Priests and legislators, by inventing religions and forging mysteries, have served the vulgar people well. They have thereby gained enthusiasts, women, and fools. Beings of this stamp are easily satisfied with things, which they are incapable of examining. The love of simplicity and truth is to be found only among the few whose imagination is regulated by study and reflection. The inhabitants of a village are never better pleased with their parson than when he introduces Latin into his sermon. The ignorant always imagine that he who speaks to them of things they do not understand is a learned man. Such is the true principle of the credulity of the people, and of the authority of those who pretend to guide nations. 113. Absurdity of all mysteries invented for the interests of priests. To announce mysteries to men is to give and withhold. It is to talk in order not to be understood. He who speaks only obscurely either seeks to amuse himself by the embarrassment which he causes, or finds his interest in not explaining himself too clearly. All secrecy indicates distrust, impotence, and fear. Princes and their ministers make a mystery of their projects, for fear their enemies should discover and render them abortive. Can a good God amuse himself by perplexing his creatures? What interest then could he have in commanding his ministers to announce riddles and mysteries? It is said that man, by the weakness of his nature, is totally incapable of understanding the divine dispensations, which can be to him only a series of mysteries. God cannot disclose to him secrets necessarily above his reach. If so, I answer again, that man is not made to attend to the divine dispensations, that these dispensations are to him by no means interesting, that he has no need of mysteries, which he cannot understand, and consequently that a mysterious religion is no more fit for him than an eloquent discourse is for a flock of sheep. 114. A universal God ought to have revealed a universal religion. The Deity has revealed himself with so little uniformity in the different countries of our globe, that in point of religion men regard one another with hatred and contempt. The partisans of the different sects think each other very ridiculous and foolish. Mysteries, most revered in one religion, are objects of derision to another. God, in revealing himself to mankind, ought, at least, to have spoken the same language to all, and saved their feeble minds the perplexity of inquiring which religion really emanated from him, or what form of worship is most acceptable in his sight. A universal God ought to have revealed a universal religion. By what fatality, then, are there so many different religions upon earth? Which is really right among the great number of those, each of which exclusively pretends to be the true one? There is great reason to believe, that no religion enjoys this advantage. Division and disputes upon opinions are indubitable signs of the uncertainty and obscurity of the principles upon which they build. 115. Religion is unnecessary, as it is unintelligible. If religion were necessary at all, it ought to be intelligible to all. If this religion were the most important concern of men, the goodness of God would seem to demand that it should be to them of all things the most clear, evident, and demonstrative. Is it not then astonishing, that this thing so essential to the happiness of mortals is precisely that which they understand least, and about which, for so many ages, their teachers have most disputed? Priests have never agreed upon the manner of understanding the will of a God, who has revealed himself. The world may be compared to a public fair, in which are several empirics, each of whom endeavors to attract the passengers by decrying the remedies sold by his brothers. Each shop has its customers, who are persuaded that their quacks possess the only true remedies, and notwithstanding a continual use of them, they perceive not the inefficacy of these remedies, or that they are as infirm as those who run after the quacks of a different shop. Devotion is a disorder of the imagination contracted in infancy. The devout man is a hypochondriac, who only augments his malady by the application of remedies. The wise man abstains from them entirely. He pays attention to his diet, and in other respects leaves nature to her course. 116. All religions are rendered ridiculous by the multitude of creeds. To a man of sense nothing appears more ridiculous than the opinions which the partisans of the different religions with equal folly entertain of each other. A Christian regards the Koran, that is, the divine revelation announced by Mahomet, as nothing but a tissue of impertinent reveries and impostures insulting to the divinity. The Mohammedan, on the other hand, treats the Christian as an idolater and a dog. He sees nothing but absurdities in his religion. He imagines he has a right to subdue the Christian, and to force him, sword in hand, to receive the religion of his divine prophet. Finally, he believes that nothing is more impious and unreasonable than to worship a man or to believe in the Trinity. The Protestant Christian, who without scruple worships a man, and firmly believes the inconceivable mystery of the Trinity, ridicules the Catholic Christian for believing in the mystery of transubstantiation. He considers him mad, impious, and idolatrous, because he kneels to worship some bread, in which he thinks he sees God. Christians of every sect regard, as silly stories, the incarnations of Vishnu, the god of the Indies. They maintain that the only true incarnation is that of Jesus, son of a carpenter. The deist, who calls himself the follower of a religion which he supposes to be that of nature, content with admitting a God, of whom he has no idea, makes a jest of all the mysteries taught by the various religions in the world. 117. Opinion of a famous theologian. Is there anything more contradictory, impossible, or mysterious than the creation of matter by an immaterial being, who, though immutable, operates continual changes in the world? Is anything more incompatible with every notion of common sense than to believe that a supremely good, wise, equitable, and powerful being presides over nature and by himself directs the movements of a world full of folly, misery, crimes, and disorders, which, by a single word, he could have prevented or removed? In fine, whenever we admit a being as contradictory as the God of theology, how can we reject the most improbable fables, astonishing miracles, and profound mysteries? 118. The God of the deists is not less contradictory. The deist exclaims, "Abstain from worshipping the cruel and capricious God of theology. Mine is a being infinitely wise and good. He is the father of men, the mildest of sovereigns. It is he who fills the universe with his benefits." But do you not see that everything in this world contradicts the good qualities which you ascribe to your God? In the numerous family of this tender Father almost all are unhappy. Under the government of this just sovereign, vice is triumphant, and virtue is distress. Among those blessings you extol, and which only enthusiasm can see, I behold a multitude of evils, against which you obstinately shut your eyes. Forced to acknowledge, that your beneficent God, in contradiction with himself, distributes good and evil with the same hand, for his justification you must, like the priest, refer me to the regions of another life. Invent, therefore, another God, for yours is no less contradictory than that of theologians. A good God, who does evil, or consents to the commission of evil, a God full of equity, and in whose empire innocence is often oppressed, a perfect God, who produces none but imperfect and miserable works, are not such a God and his conduct as great mysteries as that of the Incarnation? You blush for your fellow citizens, who allow themselves to be persuaded that the God of the universe could change himself into a man and die upon a cross in a corner of Asia. The mystery of the Incarnation appears to you very absurd. You think nothing more ridiculous than a God who transforms himself into bread, and causes himself daily to be eaten in 1,000 different places. But are all these mysteries more contradictory to reason than a God, the avenger and rewarder of the actions of men? Is man, according to you, free or not free? In either case, your God, if he has the shadow of equity, can neither punish nor reward him. If man is free, it is God who has made him free. Therefore, God is the primitive cause of all his actions. In punishing him for his faults, he would punish him for having executed what he had given him liberty to do. If man is not free to act otherwise than he does, would not God be most unjust in punishing man for faults which he could not help committing? The minor or secondary absurdities, with which all religions abound, are to many people truly striking, but they have not the courage to trace the source of these absurdities. They see not that a God full of contradictions, caprices, and inconsistent qualities, has only served to disorder men's imaginations, and to produce an endless succession of chimeras. 119. Aged belief in a deity does not prove the existence of God. The theologian would shut the mouths of those who deny the existence of God, by saying that all men, in all ages and countries, have acknowledged some divinity or other, that every people have believed in an invisible and powerful being who has been the object of their worship and veneration; in short, that there is no nation, however savage, who are not persuaded of the existence of some intelligence superior to human nature. But can an error be changed into truth by the belief of all men? The great philosopher Bayle has justly observed that general tradition, or the unanimous consent of mankind, is no criterion of truth. There was a time when all men believed that the sun moved round the earth, but this error was detected. There was a time when nobody believed the existence of the antipodes, and when everyone was persecuted who had temerity enough to maintain it. At present every informed man firmly believes it. All nations, with the exception of a few men who are less credulous than the rest, still believe in ghosts and spirits. No sensible man now adopts such nonsense. But the most sensible people consider it their duty to believe in a universal spirit. 120. All gods are savage, all religions are monuments of ignorance. All the gods adored by men are of savage origin. They have evidently been imagined by stupid people, or presented by ambitious and crafty legislators, to ignorant and uncivilized nations, who had neither capacity nor courage to examine the objects, which, through terror, they were made to worship. By closely examining God, we are forced to acknowledge that he evidently bears marks of a savage nature. To be savage is to acknowledge no right but force. It is to be cruel beyond measure. to follow only one's own caprice, to want foresight, prudence, and reason. Ye nations, who call yourselves civilized, do you not discern, in this hideous character, the God on whom you lavish your incense? Are not the descriptions given you of the divinity visibly borrowed from the implacable, jealous, revengeful, sanguinary, capricious, inconsiderate humor of man, who has not cultivated his reason? O men, you adore only a great savage, whom you regard, however, as a model to imitate, as an amiable master, as a sovereign full of perfection. Religious opinions are ancient monuments of ignorance, credulity, cowardice, and barbarism of their ancestors. Every savage is a child fond of the marvelous, who believes everything, and examines nothing. Ignorance of nature he attributes to spirits, enchantments, and to magic, whatever appears to him extraordinary. His priests appear to him sorcerers, in whom he supposes a power purely divine, before whom his confounded reason humbled itself, whose oracles are to him infallible decrees which it would be dangerous to contradict. In religion, men have, for the most part, remained in their primitive barbarity. Modern religions are only ancient follies revived, or presented under some new form. If the savages of antiquity adored mountains, rivers, serpents, trees, and idols of every kind; if the Egyptians paid homage to crocodiles, rats, and onions, do we not see nations, who think themselves wiser than they, worship bread, into which they imagine, that through the enchantments of their priests, the divinity has descended? Is not the bread god the idol of many Christian nations, who, in this respect, are as irrational as the most savage? 121. All religious usages bear marks of stupidity and barbarism. The ferocity, stupidity, and folly of uncivilized man have never disclosed themselves in religious practices, either cruel or extravagant. A spirit of barbarity still survives, and penetrates the religions even of the most polished nations. Do we not still see human victims offered to the divinity? To appease the anger of a God, who is always supposed as ferocious, jealous, and vindictive, as a savage, do not those, whose manner of thinking is supposed to displease him, expire under studied torments, by the command of sanguinary laws? Modern nations, at the instigation of their priests, have perhaps improved upon the atrocious folly of barbarous nations; at least we find that it has ever entered the heads of savages to torment for opinions, to search the thoughts, to molest men for the invisible movements of their brains. When we see learned nations, such as the English, French, German, etc., continue, notwithstanding their knowledge, to kneel before the barbarous God of the Jews; when we see these enlightened nations divide into sects, defame, hate, and despise one another for their equally ridiculous opinions concerning the conduct and intentions of this unreasonable God; when we see men of ability foolishly devote their time to meditate the will of this God, who is full of caprice and folly, we are tempted to cry out, O men, you are still savage! Section 12. Of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Good Sense, by Paul-Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 12, parts 122 to 132. 122. The more a religion is ancient and general, the more suspect. Whoever has formed true ideas of the ignorance, credulity, negligence, and stupidity of the vulgar, will suspect opinions the more, as he finds them generally established. Men, for the most part, examine nothing. They blindly submit to custom and authority. Their religious opinions, above all others, are those which they have the least courage and capacity to examine. As they comprehend nothing about them, they are forced to be silent, or at least are soon destitute of arguments. Ask any man whether he believes in a God. He will be much surprised that you can doubt it. Ask him again what he understands by the word God. You throw him into the greatest embarrassment. You will perceive immediately that he is incapable of affixing any real idea to this word he incessantly repeats. He will tell you that God is God. He knows neither what he thinks of it nor his motives for believing in it. All nations speak of a God, but do they agree upon this God? By no means. But division upon an opinion proves not its evidence. It is rather a sign of uncertainty and obscurity. Does the same man always agree with himself in the notions he forms of his God? No. His idea varies with the changes which he experiences. Another sign of uncertainty. Men always agree in demonstrative truths. In any situation, except that of insanity, everyone knows that 2 and 2 make 4, that the sun shines, that the whole is greater than its part, that benevolence is necessary to merit the affection of men, that injustice and cruelty are incompatible with goodness. Are they thus agreed when they speak of God? Whatever they think or say of him is immediately destroyed by the effects they attribute to him. Ask several painters to represent a chimera, and each will paint it in a different manner. You will find no resemblance between the features. Each has given it a portrait that has no original. All theologians, in giving us a picture of God, give us one of a great chimera, in whose features they never agree, whom each arranges in his own way, and who exists only in their imaginations. There are not 2 individuals who have, or can have, the same ideas of their God. 123. Skepticism in religious matters from very superficial study. It might be said with more truth that men are either skeptics or atheists, than that they are convinced of the existence of God. How can we be assured of the existence of a being, whom we could never examine, and of whom it is impossible to conceive any permanent idea? How can we convince ourselves of the existence of a being, to whom we are every moment forced to attribute conduct opposed to the ideas we had endeavored to form of him? Is it then possible to believe what we cannot conceive? Is not such a belief the opinions of others without having any of our own? Priests govern by faith, but do not priests themselves acknowledge that God is to them incomprehensible? Confess then that a full and entire conviction of the existence of God is not so general as is imagined. Skepticism arises from a want of motives sufficient to form a judgment. Upon examining the proofs which seem to establish, and the arguments which combat, the existence of God, some persons have doubted and withheld their assent. But this uncertainty arises from not having sufficiently examined. Is it possible to doubt anything evident? Sensible people ridicule an absolute skepticism, and think it even impossible. A man who doubted his own existence, or that of the sun, would appear ridiculous. Is this more extravagant than to doubt the non-existence of an evidently impossible being? Is it more absurd to doubt one's own existence, than to hesitate upon the impossibility of a being, whose qualities reciprocally destroy one another? Do we find greater probability for believing the existence of a spiritual being, than the existence of a stick without two ends? Is the notion of an infinitely good and powerful being, who causes or permits an infinity of evils, less absurd or impossible than that of a square triangle? Let us conclude, then, that religious skepticism can result only from a superficial examination of theological principles, which are in perpetual contradiction with the most clear and demonstrative principles. To doubt is to deliberate. Skepticism is only a state of indetermination, resulting from an insufficient examination of things. Is it possible for any one to be skeptical in matters of religion, who will deign to revert to its principles, and closely examine the notions of God, who serves as its basis? Doubt generally arises either from indolence, weakness, indifference, or incapacity. With many people, to doubt is to fear the trouble of examining things, which are thought uninteresting. But religion, being presented to men as their most important concern in this and the future world, skepticism and doubt on this subject must occasion perpetual anxiety, and must really constitute a bed of thorns. Every man who has not courage to contemplate, without prejudice, the God upon whom all religion is founded, can never know for what religion to decide. He knows not what he should believe or not believe, admit or reject, hope or fear. Indifference upon religion must not be confounded with skepticism. This indifference is founded upon the absolute assurance, or at any rate upon the probable belief, that religion is not interesting. A persuasion that a thing which is pretended to be important is not so, or is only indifferent, supposes a sufficient examination of the thing, without which it would be impossible to have this persuasion. Those who call themselves skeptics in the fundamental points of religion are commonly either indolent or incapable of examining. 124. Revelations examined. In every country we are assured, that a God has revealed himself. What has he taught men? Has he proved evidently that he exists? Has he informed them where he resides? Has he taught them what he is, or in what his essence consists? Has he clearly explained to them his intentions and plan? Does what he says of this plan correspond with the effects which we see? No. He informs them solely that he is what he is, that he is a hidden God, that his ways are unspeakable, that he is exasperated against all who have the temerity to fathom his decrees, or to consult reason in judging him or his works. Does the revealed conduct of God answer the magnificent ideas which theologians would give us of his wisdom, goodness, justice, and omnipotence? By no means. In every revelation, this conduct announces a partial and capricious being, the protector of favorite people, and the enemy of all others. If he deigns to appear to some men, he takes care to keep all others in an invincible ignorance of his divine intentions. Every private revelation evidently announces in God injustice, partiality, and malignity. Do the commands, revealed by any God, astonish us by their sublime reason or wisdom? Do they evidently tend to promote the happiness of the people, to whom the divinity discloses them? Upon examining the divine commands, one sees in every country nothing but strange ordinances, ridiculous precepts, impertinent ceremonies, puerile customs, oblations, sacrifices, and expiations, useful indeed to the ministers of God, but very burdensome to the rest of the citizens. I see likewise that these laws often tend to make men unsociable, disdainful, intolerant, quarrelsome, unjust, and inhuman, to those who have not received the same revelations, the same ordinances, or the same favors from heaven. 125. Where is the proof that God ever showed himself or spoke to men? Are the precepts of morality, announced by the Deity, really divine, or superior to those which every reasonable man might imagine? They are divine solely because it is impossible for the human mind to discover their utility. They make virtue consist in a total renunciation of nature, in a voluntary forgetfulness of reason, a holy hatred of ourselves. Finally, these sublime precepts often exhibit perfection in a conduct cruel to ourselves and perfectly useless to others. Has a God appeared? Has he himself promulgated his laws? Has he spoken to men with his own mouth? I am told that God has not appeared to a whole people, but that he has always manifested himself through the medium of some favorite personages, who have been entrusted with the care of announcing and explaining his intentions. The people have never been permitted to enter the sanctuary. The ministers of the gods have alone had the right to relate what passes there. 126. There is nothing that proves miracles to have ever been performed. If in every system of divine revelation I complain of not seeing either the wisdom, goodness, or equity of God, if I suspect knavery, ambition, or interest, it is replied, that God has confirmed by miracles the mission of those who speak in his name. But was it not more simple for him to appear in person, to explain his nature and will? Again, if I have the curiosity to examine these miracles, I find that they are improbable tales, related by suspected people, who had the greatest interest in giving out that they were the messengers of the Most High. What witnesses are appealed to in order to induce us to believe incredible miracles? Weak people, who existed thousands of years ago, and who, even though they could attest these miracles, may be suspected of being duped by their own imagination, and imposed upon by the tricks of dexterous impostors. But, you will say, these miracles are written in books, which by tradition have been transmitted to us. By whom were these books written? Who are the men who have transmitted them? They are either the founders of religions themselves, or their adherents and assigns. Thus, in religion, the evidence of interested parties becomes irrefragable and incontestable. 127. Strange that God spoke differently to different sects. God has spoken differently to every people. The Indian believes not a word of what he has revealed to the Chinese. The Mohammedan considers as fables what he has said to the Christian. The Jew regards both the Mohammedan and Christian as sacrilegious corrupters of the sacred law, which his God had given to his fathers. The Christian, proud of his more modern revelation, indiscriminately damns the Indian, Chinese, Mohammedan, and even the Jew, from whom he receives his sacred books. Who is wrong or right? Each exclaims, I am in the right. Each adduces the same proofs. Each mentions his miracles, diviners, prophets, and martyrs. The man of sense tells them they are all delirious, that God has not spoken, if it is true that he is a spirit, and can have neither mouth nor tongue, that without borrowing the organ of mortals, God could inspire his creatures with what he would have them learn, and that, as they are all equally ignorant what to think of God, it is evident that it has not been the will of God to inform them on the subject. The followers of different forms of worship which are established accuse one another of superstition and impiety. Christians look with abhorrence upon the pagan, Chinese, and Mohammedan superstition. Roman Catholics treat as impious Protestant Christians, and the latter incessantly declaim against the superstition of the Catholics. They are all right. To be impious is to have opinions offensive to the God adored. To be superstitious is to have of him false ideas. In accusing one another of superstition, the different religionists resemble humpbacks, who reproach one another with their deformity. 128. Obscurity and suspicious origin of oracles. Are the oracles, which the divinity has revealed by his different messengers, remarkable for clearness? Alas, no two men interpret them alike. Those who explain them to others are not agreed among themselves. To elucidate them, they have recourse to interpretations, to commentaries, to allegories, to explanations. They discover mystical sense very different from the literal sense. Men are everywhere wanted to explain the commands of a God, who could not, or would not, announce himself clearly to those whom he wished to enlighten. 129. Absurdity of all miracles. The founders of religion have generally proved their missions by miracles. But what is a miracle? It is an operation directly opposite to the laws of nature. But who, according to you, made those laws? God. Thus, your God, who, according to you, foresaw everything, counteracts the laws which his wisdom prescribed to nature. These laws were then defective, or at least in certain circumstances they did not accord with the views of the same God, since you inform us that he judged it necessary to suspend or counteract them. It is said that a few men, favored by the Most High, have received power to perform miracles. But to perform a miracle, it is necessary to have ability to create new causes capable of producing effects contrary to those of common causes. Is it easy to conceive that God can give men the inconceivable power of creating causes out of nothing? Is it credible that an immutable God can communicate to men power to change or rectify his plan, a power which by his essence an immutable being cannot save himself? Miracles, far from doing much honor to God, far from proving the divinity of a religion, evidently annihilate the God idea. How can a theologian tell us that God, who must have embraced the whole of his plan, who could have made none but perfect laws, and who cannot alter them, is forced to employ miracles to accomplish his projects, or can grant his creatures the power of working prodigies to execute his divine will? An omnipotent being, whose will is always fulfilled, who holds in his hand his creatures, has only to will to make them believe whatever he desires. 130. Refutation of the reasoning of Pascal on miracles. What shall we say of religions that prove their divinity by miracles? How can we credit miracles recorded in the sacred books of the Christians, where God boasts of hardening the hearts and blinding those whom he wishes to destroy, where he permits malicious spirits and magicians to work miracles as great as those of his servants, where it is predicted that Antichrist shall have power to perform prodigies capable of shaking the faith even of the elect? In this case, by what signs shall we know whether God means to instruct or ensnare us? How shall we distinguish whether the wonders we behold come from God or devil? To remove our perplexity, Pascal gravely tells us that it is necessary to judge the doctrine by the miracles, and the miracles by the doctrine; that the doctrine proves the miracles, and the miracles the doctrine. If there exist a vicious and ridiculous circle, it is undoubtedly in this splendid reasoning of one of the greatest defenders of Christianity. Where is the religion that does not boast of the most admirable doctrine, and which does not produce numerous miracles for its support. Is a miracle capable of annihilating the evidence of a demonstrated truth? Although a man should have the secret of healing all the sick, of making all the lame to walk, of raising in all the dead of a city, of ascending into the air, of stopping the course of the sun and moon, can he thereby convince me, that 2 and 2 do not make 4, that 1 makes 3, and that 3 make only 1? That a God, whose immensity fills the universe, could have been contained in the body of a Jew? That the Eternal can die like a man? That a God, who is said to be immutable, provident, and sensible, could have changed his mind upon his religion, and reformed his own work by a new revelation? 131. Every new revelation is necessarily false. According to the very principles either of natural or revealed theology, every new revelation should be regarded as false. Every change in a religion emanated from the Deity should be reputed as impiety and blasphemy. Does not all reform suppose that, in his first effort, God could not give his religion the solidity and perfection required? To say that God, in giving a first law, conformed to the rude ideas of the people whom he wished to enlighten, is to pretend that God was neither able nor willing to render the people, whom he was enlightening, so reasonable as was necessary in order to please him. Christianity is an impiety, if it is true that Judaism is a religion which has really emanated from a holy, immutable, omnipotent, and foreseeing God. The religion of Christ supposes either defects in the law which God himself had given by Moses, or impotence or malice in the same God, who was either unable or unwilling to render the Jews such as they ought to have been in order to please him. Every new religion, or reform of ancient religions, is evidently founded upon the impotence, inconstancy, imprudence, or malice of the Divinity. 132. Blood of martyrs testifies against the truth of miracles. If history informs me that the first apostles, the founders or reformers of religions, wrought great miracles, history also informs me that these reformers and their adherents were commonly buffeted, persecuted, and put to death, as disturbers of the peace of nations. I am therefore tempted to believe that they did not perform the miracles ascribed to them. Indeed, such miracles must have gained them numerous partisans among the eye-witnesses, who ought to have protected the operators from abuse. My incredulity redoubles when I am told that the workers of miracles were cruelly tormented or ignominiously executed. How is it possible to believe that missionaries, protected by God, invested with his divine power, and enjoying the gift of miracles, could not have wrought such a simple miracle as to escape the cruelty of their persecutors? Priests have the art of drawing from the persecutions themselves a convincing proof in favor of the religion of the persecuted. But a religion which boasts of having cost the lives of many martyrs, and informs us that its founders, in order to extend it, have suffered punishments, cannot be the religion of a beneficent, equitable, and omnipotent God. A good God would not permit men, entrusted with announcing his commands, to be ill-treated. An all-powerful God, wishing to found a religion, would proceed in a manner more simple and less fatal to the most faithful of his servants. To say that God would have his religion sealed with blood, is to say that he is weak, unjust, ungrateful, and sanguinary, and that he is cruel enough to sacrifice his messengers to the views of his ambition. End of section 12. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 13 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul-Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 13, Parts 133 through 140. 133. Fanaticism of martyrs and the interested zeal of missionaries. To die for religion proves not that the religion is true or divine, it proves, at most, that it is supposed to be such. An enthusiast proves nothing by his death, unless that religious fanaticism is often stronger than the love of life. An impostor may sometimes die with courage. He then makes, in the language of the proverb, a virtue of necessity. People are often surprised and affected at sight of the generous courage and disinterested zeal which has prompted missionaries to preach their doctrine even at the risk of suffering the most rigorous treatment. From this ardor for the salvation of men are drawn inferences favorable to the religion they have announced. But in reality, this disinterestedness is only apparent. He who ventures nothing should gain nothing. A missionary seeks to make his fortune by his doctrine. He knows that if he is fortunate enough to sell his commodity, he will become absolute master of those who receive him for their guide. He is sure of becoming the object of their attention, respect, and veneration. Such are the true motives which kindle the zeal and charity of so many preachers and missionaries. To die for an opinion proves the truth or goodness of that opinion no more than to die in battle proves the justice of a cause in which thousands have the folly to devote their lives. The courage of a martyr elated with the idea of paradise is not more supernatural than the courage of a soldier intoxicated with the idea of glory, or impelled by the fear of disgrace. What is the difference between an Iroquois, who sings while he is burning by inches, and the martyr St. Lawrence, who upon the gridiron insults his tyrant? The preachers of a new doctrine fail because they are the weakest. Apostles generally practice a perilous trade. Their courageous death proves neither the truth of their principles, nor their own sincerity, any more than the violent death of the ambitious man, or of the robber, proves that they were right in disturbing society, or that they thought themselves authorized in so doing. The trade of a missionary was always flattering to ambition, and formed a convenient method of living at the expense of the vulgar. These advantages have often been enough to efface every idea of danger. 134. Theology makes its God an enemy to reason and common sense. You tell us, theologians, that what is folly in the eyes of men is the wisdom before God, who delights to confound the wisdom of the wise. But do you not say that human wisdom is a gift of heaven? In saying this wisdom displeases God is but folly in his sight, and that he is pleased to confound it, you declare that your God is the friend only of ignorant people, and that he makes sensible people a fatal present for which this perfidious tyrant promises to punish them cruelly at some future day. Is it not strange that one can be the friend of your God only by declaring oneself the enemy of reason and good sense? 135. Faith irreconcilable with reason, and reason preferable to faith. According to the divines, faith is an assent without evidence. Whence it follows, that religion requires us firmly to believe inevident things, and propositions often improbable or contrary to reason. But when we reject reason as a judge of faith, do we not confess that reason is incompatible with faith? As the ministers of religion have resolved to banish reason, they must have felt the impossibility of reconciling it with faith, which is visibly only a blind submission to priests, whose authority seems to many persons more weighty than evidence itself, and preferable to the testimony of the senses. Sacrifice your reason, renounce experience, mistrust the testimony of your senses, submit without inquiry to what we announce to you in the name of heaven. Such is the uniform language of priests throughout the world. They agree upon no point, except upon the necessity of never reasoning upon the principles which they present to us as most important to our felicity. I will not sacrifice my reason, because this reason alone enables me to distinguish good from evil, truth from falsehood. If, as you say, my reason comes from God, I shall never believe that a God, whom you call good, has given me reason as a snare to lead me to perdition. Priests, do you not see that by decrying reason you calumniate your God from whom you declare it to be a gift? I will not renounce experience, because it is a guide much more sure than the imagination or authority of spiritual guides. Experience teaches me that enthusiasm and interest may blind and lead them astray themselves, and that the authority of experience ought to have much more influence upon my mind than the suspicious testimony of many men, who I know are either very liable to be deceived themselves, or otherwise are very much interested in deceiving others. I will mistrust my senses, because I am sensible they sometimes mislead me. But, on the other hand, I know that they will not always deceive me. I well know that the eye shows me the sun much smaller than it really is, but experience, which is only the repeated application of the senses, informs me that objects always appear to diminish as their distance increases. Thus I attain to a certainty that the sun is much larger than the earth. Thus my senses suffice to rectify the hasty judgments which they themselves had caused. In warning us to mistrust the testimony of our senses, the priests annihilate the proofs of all religion. If men may be dupes of their imagination, if their senses are deceitful, how shall we believe the miracles which struck the treacherous senses of our ancestors? If my senses are unfaithful guides, I ought not to credit even the miracles wrought before my eyes. 136. To what absurd and ridiculous sophisms the religious are reduced. You incessantly repeat that the truths of religion are above reason. If so, do you not perceive that these truths are not adapted to reasonable beings? To pretend that reason can deceive us is to say that truth can be false, that the useful can be hurtful. Is reason anything but a knowledge of the useful and true? Besides, as our reason and senses are our only guides in this life, to say they are unfaithful is to say that our errors are necessary, our ignorance invincible, and that, without the extreme of injustice, God cannot punish us for following the only guides it was his supreme will to give. To say we are obliged to believe things above our reason is ridiculous. To assure us that upon some objects we are not allowed to consult reason is to say that, in the most interesting matter, we must consult only imagination, or act only at random. Our divines say we must sacrifice our reason to God. But what motives can we have to sacrifice our reason to a being who makes us only useless presents, which he does not intend us to use? What confidence can we put in a God, who, according to our divines themselves, is malicious enough to harden the heart, to strike with blindness, to lay snares for us, to lead us into temptation? In fine, what confidence can we put in the ministers of this God, who, to guide us more conveniently, commands us to shut our eyes? 137. Ought a man to believe on the assurance of another man? Men are persuaded that religion is to them of all things the most serious, while it is precisely what they least examine for themselves. In pursuit of an office, a piece of land, a house, a place of profit, in any transaction or contract whatever, every one carefully examines all, takes the greatest precaution, weighs every word of a writing, is guarded against every surprise. Not so in religion. Every one receives it at a venture, and believes it upon the word of others, without ever taking the trouble to examine. Two causes concur to foster the negligence and carelessness of men with regard to their religious opinions. The first is the despair of overcoming the obscurity, in which all religion is necessarily enveloped. Their first principles are only adapted to disguise lazy minds, who regard them as a chaos impossible to be understood. The second cause is, that every one is averse to being too much bound by severe precepts, which all admire in theory, but very few care to practice with rigor. The religion of many people is like old family ties, which they have never taken pains to examine, but which they deposit in their archives, to have recourse to them occasionally. 138. Faith can take root only in feeble, ignorant, or slothful minds. The disciples of Pythagoras paid implicit faith to the doctrine of their master. "He has said it," was to them the solution of every problem. The generality of men are not more rational. In matters of religion, a curate, a priest, an ignorant monk, becomes master of the thoughts. Faith relieves the weakness of the human mind, to which application is commonly painful. It is much more convenient to depend upon others, than to examine for one's self. Inquiry, being slow and difficult, equally displeases the stupidity of the ignorant, and the ardor of the enlightened. Such is undoubtedly the reason why faith has so many partisans. The more men are deficient in knowledge and reason, the more zealous they are in religion. In theological quarrels, the populace, like ferocious beasts, fall upon all those, against whom their priest is desirous of exciting them. A profound ignorance, boundless credulity, weak intellect, and warm imagination, are the materials of which are made bigots, zealots, fanatics, and saints. How can the voice of reason be heard by them who make it a principle never to examine for themselves, but to submit blindly to the guidance of others? The saints and the populace are, in the hands of their directors, automatons, moved at pleasure. 139. That one religion has greater pretensions to truth and absurdity. Religion is an affair of custom and fashion. We must do as others do. But, among the numerous religions in the world, which should men choose? This inquiry would be too painful and long. They must therefore adhere to the religion of their fathers, to that of their country, which, having force on its side, must be the best. If we judge of the intentions of Providence by the events and revolutions of this world, we are compelled to believe, that he is very indifferent about the various religions upon earth. For thousands of years, paganism, polytheism, idolatry were the prevailing religions. We are now assured, that the most flourishing nations had not the least idea of God, an idea regarded as so essential to the happiness of man. Christians say, all mankind lived in the grossest ignorance of their duties toward God, and had no notions of him, but what were insulting to his divine majesty. Christianity, growing out of Judaism, very humble in its obscure origin, became powerful and cruel under the Christian emperors, who, prompted by holy zeal, rapidly spread it in their empire by means of fire and sword, and established it upon the ruins of paganism. Mahomet and his successors, seconded by Providence, or their victorious arms, in a short time banished the Christian religion from a part of Asia, Africa, and even Europe, and the gospel was then forced to yield to the Koran. In all the factions or sects, which for many ages have distracted Christianity, the best argument has been always that of the strongest party. Arms have decided which doctrine is most conducive to the happiness of nations. May we not hence infer, either that the Deity feels little interested in the religion of men, or that he always declares in favor of the opinions which best suit the interest of earthly powers; in fine, that he changes his plan to accommodate their fancy? Rulers infallibly decide the religion of the people. The true religion is always the religion of the prince, the true God is the God whom the prince desires his people to adore. The will of the priests, who govern the prince, always becomes the will of God. A wit justly observed that the true religion is always that on whose side are the prince and the hangman. Emperors and hangmen long supported the gods of Rome against the God of Christians. The latter, having gained to his interest the emperors, their soldiers, and their hangmen, succeeded in destroying the worship of the Roman gods. The God of Mahomet has dispossessed the God of Christians of a great part of the dominions which he formerly occupied. In the eastern part of Asia is a vast, flourishing, fertile, populous country, governed by such wise laws, that the fiercest conquerors have adopted them with respect. I mean China. Excepting Christianity, which was banished as dangerous, the people there follow such superstitions as they please, while the mandarins or magistrates, having long known the errors of the popular religion, are vigilant to prevent the bonzes or priests from using it as an instrument of discord. Yet we see not that Providence refuses his blessing to a nation whose chiefs are so indifferent about the worship that is rendered to him. On the contrary, the Chinese enjoy a happiness and repose worthy to be envied by the many nations whom religion divides and often devastates. We cannot reasonably propose to divest the people of their follies, but we may perhaps cure the follies of those who govern the people, and who will then prevent the follies of the people from becoming dangerous. Superstition is to be feared only when princes and soldiers rally round her standard; then she becomes cruel and sanguinary. Every sovereign, who is the protector of one sect or religious faction, is commonly the tyrant of others, and becomes himself the most cruel disturber of the peace of his dominions. 140. Religion is unnecessary to morality. It is incessantly repeated, and many sensible persons are induced to believe, that religion is a restraint necessary to men, that without it there would no longer exist the least check for the vulgar, and that morality and religion are intimately connected with it. "The fear of the Lord," cries the priest, "is the beginning of wisdom. The terrors of another life are salutary, and are proper to curb the passions of men." To perceive the inutility of religious notions, we have only to open our eyes and contemplate the morals of those nations who are the most under the dominion of religion. We there find proud tyrants, oppressive ministers, perfidious courtiers, shameless extortioners, corrupt magistrates, knaves, adulterers, debauchees, prostitutes, thieves, and rogues of every kind, who have never doubted either the existence of an avenging and rewarding God, the torments of hell, or the joys of paradise. Without the least utility to the greater part of mankind, the ministers of religion have studied to render death terrible to the eyes of their followers. If devout Christians could but be consistent, they would pass their whole life in tears, and die under the most dreadful apprehensions. What can be more terrible than death to the unfortunate who are told that it is horrible to fall into the hands of the living God, that we must work out our salvation with fear and trembling? Yet we are assured that the death of the Christian is attended with infinite consolations, of which the unbeliever is deprived. The good Christian, it is said, dies in the firm hope of an eternal happiness which he has strived to merit. But is not this firm assurance itself a presumption punishable in the eyes of a severe God? Ought not the greatest saints to be ignorant whether they are worthy of love or hatred? Ye priests, while consoling us with the hope of the joys of paradise, have you then had the advantage to see your names and ours inscribed in the book of life? End of section 13. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 14 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul-Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 14. Parts 141 through 149. 141. Religion the weakest barrier that can be opposed to the passions. To oppose the passions and present interests of men, the obscure notions of a metaphysical, inconceivable God, the incredible punishments of another life, or the pleasures of the heaven, of which nobody has the least idea, is not this combating realities with fictions? Men have never any but confused ideas of their God. They see him only in clouds. They never think of him when they are desirous to do evil. Whenever ambition, fortune, or pleasure allures them, God's threatenings and promises are forgotten. In the things of this life there is a degree of certainty, which the most lively faith cannot give to the things of another life. Every religion was originally a curb invented by legislators, who wished to establish their authority over the minds of rude nations. Like nurses who frighten children to oblige them to be quiet, the ambitious used the name of the gods to frighten savages, and had recourse to terror in order to make them support quietly the yoke they wished to impose. Are then the bugbears of infancy made for riper age? At the age of maturity no man longer believes them. Or, if he does, they excite little emotion in him, and never alter his conduct. 142. Honor is more salutary and powerful bond than religion. Almost every man fears what he sees much more than what he does not see. He fears the judgments of men of which he feels the effects, more than the judgments of God, of whom he has only fluctuating ideas. The desire of pleasing the world, the force of custom, the fear of ridicule and of censure, have more force than all religious opinions. Does not the soldier, through fear of disgrace, daily expose his life in battle, even at the risk of incurring eternal damnation? The most religious persons have often more respect for a varlet than for God. A man who firmly believes that God sees everything, and that he is omniscient and omnipresent, will be guilty, when alone, of actions which he would never do in presence of the meanest of mortals. Those who pretend to be the most fully convinced of the existence of God every moment act as if they believed the contrary. 143. Religion does not restrain the passions of kings. Let us at least, it will be said, cherish the idea of a God, which alone may serve as a barrier to the passions of kings. But can we sincerely admire the wonderful effects which the fear of this God generally produces upon the minds of princes who are called his images? What idea shall we form of the original, if we judge of it by the copies? Sovereigns, it is true, call themselves the representatives of God, his vicegerents upon earth. But does the fear of a master, more powerful than they are, incline them seriously to study the welfare of the nations whom Providence has entrusted to their care? Does the pretended terror, which ought to be inspired into them by the idea of an invisible judge, to whom alone they acknowledge themselves accountable for their actions, render them more equitable, more compassionate, more sparing of blood and treasure of their subjects, more temperate in their pleasures, more attentive to their duties? In fine, does this God, by whose authority kings reign, deter them from inflicting 1,000 evils upon the people to whom they ought to act as guides, protectors, and fathers? Alas, if we survey the whole earth, we shall see men almost everywhere governed by tyrants, who use religion merely as an instrument to render more stupid the slaves whom they overwhelm under the weight of their vices, or whom they sacrifice without mercy to their extravagancies. Far from being a check upon the passions of kings, religion, by its very principles, frees them from all restraint. It transforms them into divinities, whose caprice the people are never permitted to resist. While it gives up the reins to princes, and on their part breaks the bonds of the social compact, it endeavors to chain the minds and hands of their oppressed subjects. Is it then surprising, that the gods of the earth imagine everything lawful for them, and regard their subjects only as instruments of their caprice or ambition? In every country, religion has represented the monarch of nature as a cruel, fantastical, partial tyrant, whose caprice is law. The monarch God is but too faithfully imitated by his representatives upon earth. Religion seems everywhere invented solely to lull the people in the lap of slavery, in order that their masters may easily oppress them, or render them wretched with impunity. 144. Origin of the divine right of kings. To guard against the enterprises of a haughty pontiff who wished to reign over kings, to shelter their persons from the attempts of credulous nations excited by the priests, several European princes have pretended to hold their crowns and rights from God alone, and to be accountable only to him for their actions. After a long contest between the civil and spiritual power, the former at length triumphed, and the priests, forced to yield, acknowledged the divine right of kings and preached them to the people, reserving the liberty of changing their minds and of preaching revolt, whenever the divine rights of kings clashed with the divine rights of the clergy. It was always at the expense of nations that peace was concluded between kings and priests, but the latter, in spite of treaties, always preserved their pretensions. Tyrants and wicked princes, whose consciences continually reproached them with negligence or perversity, far from fearing their God, had rather deal with this invisible judge who never opposes anything, or with his priests who are always condescending to the rulers of the earth, than with their own subjects. The people, reduced to despair, might probably appeal from the divine right of their chiefs. Men, when oppressed to the last degree, sometimes become turbulent, and the divine rights of the tyrant are then forced to yield to the natural rights of the subjects. It is cheaper dealing with gods than men. Kings are accountable for their actions to God alone. Priests are accountable only to themselves. There is much reason to believe that both are more confident of the indulgence of heaven than of that of earth. It is much easier to escape the vengeance of gods who may be cheaply appeased, than the vengeance of men whose patience is exhausted. If you remove the fear of an invisible power, what restraint will you impose upon the passions of sovereigns? Let them learn to reign. Let them learn to be just, to respect the rights of the people, and to acknowledge the kindness of the nations, from whom they hold their greatness and power. Let them learn to fear men, and to submit to the laws of equity. Let nobody transgress these laws with impunity, and let them be equally binding upon the powerful and the weak, the great and the small, the sovereign and the subjects. The fear of gods, religion, and the terrors of another life, are the metaphysical and supernatural bulwarks, opposed to the impetuous passions of princes. Are these bulwarks effectual? Let experience resolve the question. To oppose religion to the wickedness of tyrants, is to wish, that vague, uncertain, unintelligible speculations may be stronger than propensities, which everything conspires daily to strengthen. 145. Religion is fatal to political ameliorations. The immense service of religion to politics is incessantly boasted. But a little reflection will convince us, that religious opinions equally blind both sovereigns and people, and never enlighten them upon their true duties or interests. Religion but too often forms licentious, immoral despots, obeyed by slaves, whom everything obliges to conform to their views. For want of having studied or known the true principles of administration, the objects and rights of social life, the real interests of men and their reciprocal duties, princes, in almost every country, have become licentious, absolute, and perverse, and their subjects abject, wicked, and unhappy. It was to avoid the trouble of studying these important objects, that recourse was had to chimeras, which, far from remedying anything, have hitherto only multiplied the evils of mankind, and diverted them from whatever is most essential to their happiness. Does not the unjust and cruel manner, in which so many nations are governed, manifestly furnish one of the strongest proofs, not only of the small effect produced by the fear of another life, but also of the non-existence of a Providence, busied with the fate of the human race? If there existed a good God, should we not be forced to admit, that in this life he strangely neglects the greater part of mankind? It would seem, that this God has created nations only to be the sport of the passions and follies of his representatives upon earth. 146. Christianity preaching implicit obedience to despotism. By reading history with attention, we shall perceive that Christianity, at first weak and servile, established itself among the savages and free nations of Europe, only intimating to their chiefs, that its religious principles favoured despotism and rendered them absolute. Consequently, we see barbarous princes suddenly converted; that is, we see them adopt, without examination, a system so favourable to their ambition, and use every art to induce their subjects to embrace it. If the ministers of this religion have since often derogated from their favourite principles, it is because the theory influences the conduct of the ministers of the Lord, only when it suits their temporal interests. Christianity boasts of procuring men a happiness unknown to preceding ages. It is true, the Greeks knew not the divine rights of tyrants or of the usurpers of the rights of their country. Under paganism, it never entered the head of any man to suppose, that it was against the will of heaven for a nation to defend themselves against a ferocious beast, who had the audacity to lay waste their possessions. The religion of the Christians was the first that screened tyrants from danger, by laying down as a principle, that the people must renounce the legitimate defence of themselves. Thus Christian nations are deprived of the first law of nature, which orders man to resist evil, and to disarm whoever is preparing to destroy him. If the ministers of the church have often permitted the people to revolt for the interest of heaven, They have never permitted them to revolt for their own deliverance from real evils or known violences. From heaven came the chains that were used for fettering the minds of mortals. Why is the Mohammedan everywhere a slave? Because his prophet enslaved him in the name of the Deity, as Moses had before subdued the Jews. In all parts of the earth, we see that the first legislators were the first sovereigns and the first priests of the savages, to whom they gave laws. Religion seems invented solely to exalt princes above their nations, and rivet the fetters of slavery. As soon as the people are too unhappy here below, priests are ready to silence them by threatening them with the anger of God. They are made to fix their eyes upon heaven, lest they should perceive the true causes of their misfortunes, and apply the remedies which nature presents. 147. One object of religious principles: eternize the tyranny of kings. By dint of repeating to men that the earth is not their true country, that the present life is only a passage, that they are not made to be happy in this world, that their sovereigns hold their authority from God alone, and are accountable only to him for the abuse of it, that is not lawful to resist them, etc., priests have eternized the misgovernment of kings and the misery of the people. The interests of nations have been basely sacrificed to their chiefs. The more we consider the dogmas and principles of religion, the more we shall be convinced that their sole object is the advantage of tyrants and priests, without regard to that of societies. To mask the impotence of its deaf gods, religion has persuaded mortals, that iniquities always kindle the wrath of heaven. People impute to themselves alone the disasters that daily befall them. If nations sometimes feel the strokes of convulsed nature, their bad governments are but too often the immediate and permanent causes, from whence proceed the continual calamities which they are forced to endure. Are not the ambition, negligence, vices, and oppressions of kings and nobles generally the causes of scarcity, beggary, wars, pestilences, corrupt morals, and all the multiplied scourges which desolate the earth? In fixing men's eyes continually upon heaven, in persuading them that all their misfortunes are effects of divine anger, in providing none but ineffectual and futile means to put an end to their sufferings, we might justly conclude, that the only object of priests was to divert nations from thinking about the true sources of their misery, and thus to render it eternal. The ministers of religion conduct themselves almost like those indigent mothers who, for want of bread, sing their starved children to sleep, or give them playthings to divert their thoughts from afflicting hunger. Blinded by error from their very infancy, restrained by the invisible bonds of opinion, overcome by panic terrors, their faculties blunted by ignorance, how should the people know the true causes of their wretchedness? They imagine, that they can avert it by invoking the gods. Alas! Do they not see, that it is in the name of these gods, that they are ordered to present their throats to the sword of their merciless tyrants, in whom they might find the obvious cause of the evils under which they groan, and for whom they cease not to implore, in vain, the assistance of heaven? Ye credulous people! In your misfortunes, redouble your prayers, offerings, and sacrifices, throng to your temples, fast in sackcloth and ashes, bathe yourselves in your own tears, and above all, completely ruin yourselves to enrich your gods. You will only enrich their priests. The gods of heaven will be propitious only when the gods of the earth shall acknowledge themselves men like you, and shall devote to your welfare the attention you deserve. 148. Fatal it is to persuade kings they are responsible to God alone. Negligent, ambitious, and perverse princes are the real causes of public misfortunes. Useless, unjust wars depopulate the earth. Encroaching and despotic governments absorb the benefits of nature. The rapacity of courts discourages agriculture, extinguishes industry, produces want, pestilence, and misery. Heaven is neither cruel nor propitious to the prayers of the people. It is their proud chiefs, who have almost always hearts of stone. It is destructive to the morals of princes to persuade them that they have God alone to fear when they injure their subjects or neglect their happiness. Sovereigns, it is not the gods, but your people that you offend when you do evil. It is your people and yourselves that you injure when you govern unjustly. In history nothing is more common than to see religious tyrants, nothing more rare than to find equitable, vigilant, enlightened princes. A monarch may be pious, punctual in a servile discharge of the duties of his religion, very submissive and liberal to his priests, and yet at the same time be destitute of every virtue and talent necessary for governing. To princes, religion is only an instrument destined to keep the people more completely under the yoke. By the excellent principles of religious morality, a tyrant who, during a long reign, has done nothing but oppress his subjects, wresting from them the fruits of their labor, sacrificing them without mercy to his insatiable ambition, a conqueror who has usurped the provinces of others, slaughtered whole nations, and who, during his whole life, has been a scourge to mankind, imagines his conscience may rest, when, to expiate so many crimes, he has wept at the feet of a priest, who generally has the base complacence to console and encourage a robber, whom the most hideous despair would too lightly punish for the misery he has caused upon earth. 149. A devout king is the scourge of his kingdom. A sovereign, sincerely devout, is commonly dangerous to the state. Credulity always supposes a contracted mind. Devotion generally absorbs the attention, which a prince should pay to the government of his people. Obsequious to the suggestions of his priests, he becomes the sport of their caprices, the favourer of their quarrels, and the instrument and accomplice of their follies, which he imagines to be of the greatest importance. Among the most fatal presents, which religion has made the world, ought to be reckoned those devout and zealous monarchs, who, under an idea of working for the welfare of their subjects, have made it a sacred duty to torment, persecute, and destroy those who thought differently from themselves. A bigot, at the head of an empire, is one of the greatest scourges. A single fanatical or knavish priest, listened to by a credulous and powerful prince, suffices to put a state in disorder. In almost all countries, priests and pious persons are entrusted with forming the minds and hearts of young princes, destined to govern nations. What qualifications have instructors of this stamp? By what interests can they be animated? Full of prejudices themselves, they will teach their pupil to regard superstition as almost important and sacred, its chimerical duties as most indispensable, intolerance and persecution as the true foundation of his future authority. They will endeavor to make him a party leader, a turbulent fanatic, a tyrant. They will early stifle his reason, and forewarn him against the use of it. They will prevent truth from reaching his ears. They will exasperate him against true talents, and prejudice him in favor of contemptible ones. In short, they will make him a weak devotee, who will have no idea either of justice or injustice, nor of true glory, nor of true greatness, and who will be destitute of the knowledge and virtues necessary to the government of a great nation. Such is the plan of the education of a child destined one day to create the happiness or misery of millions of men. End of section 14. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 15 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul-Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 15, parts 150 through 160. 150. Tyranny finds religion a weak obstacle to the despair of the people. Priests have ever shown themselves the friends of despotism and the enemies of public liberty. Their trade requires abject and submissive slaves who have never the audacity to reason. In an absolute government, whoever gains an ascendancy over the mind of a weak and stupid prince becomes master of the state. Instead of conducting the people to salvation, priests have always conducted them to servitude. In consideration of the supernatural titles which religion has forged for the worst of princes, the latter have commonly united with priests, who, sure of governing by opinion the sovereign himself, have undertaken to bind the hands of the people and to hold them under the yoke. But the tyrant, covered with the shield of religion, in vain flatters himself that he is secure from every stroke of fate. Opinion is a weak rampart against the despair of the people. Besides, the priest is a friend of the tyrant only while he finds his account in tyranny. He preaches sedition and demolishes the idol he has made when he finds it no longer sufficiently conformable to the interest of God, whom he makes to speak at his will, and who never speaks except according to his interests. It will no doubt be said that sovereigns, knowing all the advantages which religion procures them, are truly interested in supporting it with all their strength. If religious opinions are useful to tyrants, it is very evident that they are useful to those who govern by the laws of reason and equity. Is there, then, any advantage in exercising tyranny? Are princes truly interested in being tyrants? Does not tyranny deprive them of true power, of the love of the people, and of all safety? Ought not every reasonable prince to perceive that the despot is a madman and an enemy to himself? Should not every enlightened prince beware of flatterers, whose object is to lull him to sleep upon the brink of the precipice which they form beneath him? 151. Religion favors the wickedness of princes. If sacerdotal flatteries succeed in perverting princes and making them tyrants, tyrants, on their part, necessarily corrupt both the great and the humble. Under an unjust ruler, void of goodness and virtue, who knows no law but his caprice, a nation must necessarily be depraved. Will this ruler wish to have about his person honest, enlightened, and virtuous men? No. He wants none but flatterers, approvers, imitators, slaves, base and servile souls, who conform themselves to his inclinations. His court will propagate the contagion of vice among the lower ranks. All will gradually become corrupted in a state whose chief is corrupt. It was long since said that princes seem to command others to do whatever they do themselves. Religion, far from being a restraint upon sovereigns, enables them to indulge without fear or remorse in acts of licentiousness as injurious to themselves as to the nations whom they govern. It is never with impunity that men are deceived. Tell a sovereign that he is a god, he will very soon believe that he owes nothing to anyone. Provided he is feared, he will care very little about being loved. He will observe neither rules nor relations with his subjects, nor duties towards them. Tell this prince that he is accountable for his actions to God alone, and he will soon act as if he were accountable to no one. 152. What is an enlightened sovereign? An enlightened sovereign is he who knows his true interests, who knows that they are connected with the interests of his nation, that a prince cannot be great, powerful, beloved, or respected, while he commands only unhappy slaves, that equity, beneficence, and vigilance will give him more real authority over his people than the fabulous titles said to be derived from heaven. He will see that religion is useful only to priests, that it is useless to society and often troubles it, and that it ought to be restrained in order to be prevented from doing injury. Finally, he will perceive that to reign with glory he must have good laws and inculcate virtue, and not found his power upon impostures and fallacies. 153. Of the prevailing passions and crimes of the priesthood. The ministers of religion have taken great care to make of their God a formidable, capricious, and fickle tyrant. Such a God was necessary to their variable interests. A God who should be just and good, without mixture of caprice or perversity. A God who had constantly the qualities of an honest man, or of a kind sovereign, would by no means suit his ministers. It is useful to priests that men should tremble before their God, in order that they may apply to them to obtain relief from their fears. No man is a hero before his valet de chambre. It is not surprising that a God, dressed up by his priests so as to be terrible to others, should rarely impose upon them, or should have but very little influence upon their conduct. Hence, in every country, their conduct is very much the same. Under pretext of the glory of their God, they everywhere prey upon ignorance, degrade the mind, discourage industry, and sow discord. Ambition and avarice have at all times been the ruling passions of the priesthood. The priest everywhere rises superior to sovereigns and laws. We see him everywhere occupied with the interests of his pride, of his cupidity, and of his despotic, revengeful humour. In the room of useful and social virtues, he everywhere substitutes expiations, sacrifices, ceremonies, mysterious practices, in a word, inventions lucrative to himself and ruinous to others. The mind is confounded and the reason is amazed upon viewing the ridiculous customs and pitiful means which the ministers of the gods have invented in every country to purify souls and render heaven favourable. Here they cut off part of a child's prepuce to secure for him divine benevolence. There they pour water upon his head to cleanse him of crimes which he could not as yet have committed. In one place they command him to plunge into a river whose waters have the power of washing away all stains. In another he is forbidden to eat certain food, the use of which will not fail to excite the celestial wrath. In other countries they enjoin upon sinful man to come periodically and confess his faults to a priest, who is often a greater sinner than himself, etc., etc., etc. 154. The Quackery of Priests. What should we say of a set of empirics, who, resorting every day to a public place, should extol the goodness of their remedies, and vend them as infallible, while they themselves were full of the infirmities, which they pretend to cure? Should we have much confidence in the recipes of these quacks, though they stun us with crying, "Take our remedies, their effects are infallible. They cure everybody, except us"? What should we afterwards think, should those quacks spend their lives in complaining, that their remedies never produced the desired effect upon the sick, who take them? In fine, what idea should we form of the stupidity of the vulgar, who, notwithstanding these confessions, should not cease to pay dearly for remedies, the inefficacy of which everything tends to prove? Priests resemble these alchemists, who boldly tell us they have the secret of making gold, while they have scarcely clothes to cover their nakedness. The ministers of religion incessantly declaim against the corruption of the age, and loudly complain of the little effect of their lessons, while at the same time they assure us, that religion is the universal remedy, the true panacea against the wickedness of mankind. These priests are very sick themselves, yet men continue to frequent their shops, and to have faith in their divine antidotes, which, by their own confession, never effect a cure. 155. Religion has corrupted morality and produced innumerable evils. Religion, especially with the moderns, has tried to identify itself with morality, the principles of which it has thereby totally obscured. It has rendered men unsociable by duty, and forced them to be inhuman to every one who thought differently from themselves. Theological disputes, equally unintelligible to each of the enraged parties, have shaken empires, caused revolutions, been fatal to sovereigns, and desolated all Europe. These contemptible quarrels have not been extinguished even in rivers of blood. Since the extinction of paganism, the people have made it a religious principle to become outrageous, whenever any opinion is advanced which their priests think contrary to sound doctrine. The sectaries of a religion, which preaches in appearance nothing but charity, concord, and peace, have proved themselves more ferocious than cannibals or savages, whenever their divines excited them to destroy their brethren. There is no crime, which men have not committed under the idea of pleasing the divinity, or appeasing his wrath. The idea of a terrible God, whom we paint to ourselves as a despot, must necessarily render his subjects wicked. Fear makes only slaves, and slaves are cowardly, base, cruel, and think everything lawful, in order to gain the favor or escape the chastisements of the master whom they fear. Liberty of thinking alone can give men humanity and greatness of soul. The notion of a tyrant God tends only to make them abject, morose, quarrelsome, intolerant slaves. Every religion, which supposes a God easily provoked, jealous, revengeful, punctilious about his rights, or the etiquette with which he is treated, a God little enough to be hurt by the opinions which men can form of him, a God unjust enough to require that we have uniform notions of his conduct, a religion which supposes such a God necessarily becomes restless, unsociable, and sanguinary. The worshippers of such a God would never think that they could, without offense, forbear hating and even destroying every one who is pointed out to them as an adversary of this God. They would think that it would be to betray the cause of their celestial monarch to live in friendly intercourse with rebellious fellow citizens. If we love what God hates, do we not expose ourselves to his implacable hatred? Infamous persecutors and devout men-haters, will you never discern the folly and injustice of your intolerant disposition? Do you not see that man is no more master of his religious opinions, his belief or unbelief, than of the language which he learns from infancy? To punish a man for his errors, is it not to punish him for having been educated differently from you? If I am an unbeliever, is it possible for me to banish from my mind the reasons that have shaken my faith? If your God gives men leave to be damned, what have you to meddle with? Are you more prudent and wise than this God, whose rights you would avenge? 156. Every religion is intolerant. There is no devotee who does not, according to his temperament, hate, despise, or pity the adherents of a sect different from his own. The established religion, which is never any other than that of the sovereign and the armies, always makes its superiority felt in a very cruel and injurious manner by the weaker sects. As yet there is no true toleration upon earth. Men everywhere adore a jealous God, of whom each nation believes itself the friend, to the exclusion of all others. Every sect boasts of adoring alone the true God, the universal God, the sovereign of all nature. But when we come to examine this monarch of the world, we find that every society, sect, party, or religious cabal makes of this powerful God only a pitiful sovereign, whose care and goodness extend only to a small number of his subjects, who pretend that they alone have the happiness to enjoy his favors, and that he is not at all concerned about the others. The founders of religions, and the priests who support them, evidently proposed to separate the nations, whom they taught, from the other nations. They wished to separate their own flock by distinguishing marks. They gave their followers gods, who were hostile to the other gods. They taught them modes of worship, dogmas, and ceremonies apart. And above all, they persuaded them that the religion of others was impious and abominable. By this unworthy artifice, the ambitious knaves established their usurpation over the minds of their followers, rendered them unsociable, and made them regard with an evil eye all persons who had not the same mode of worship and the same ideas as they had. Thus it is that religion has shut up the heart, and forever banished from it the affection that man ought to have for his fellow creature. Sociability, indulgence, humanity, those first virtues of all morality, are totally incompatible with religious prejudices. 157. The evils of a state religion. Every national religion is calculated to make man vain, unsociable, and wicked. The first step towards humanity is to permit every one peaceably to embrace the mode of worship and opinions which he judges to be right. But this conduct cannot be pleasing to the ministers of religion, who wish to have the right of tyrannizing over men even in their thoughts. Blind and bigoted princes! You hate and persecute heretics, and order them to execution, because you are told that these wretches displease God. But do you not say that your God is full of goodness? How then can you expect to please him by acts of barbarity, which he must necessarily disapprove? Besides, who has informed you that their opinions displease your God? Your priests? But who assures you that your priests are not themselves deceived, or wish to deceive you? The same priests? Princes, it is then upon the hazardous word of your priests that you commit the most atrocious crimes, under the idea of pleasing the divinity. 158. Religion legitimates and authorizes crime. Pascal says that man never does evil so fully and cheerfully as when he acts from a false principle of conscience. Nothing is more dangerous than a religion which lets loose the ferocity of the multitude and justifies their blackest crimes. They will set no bounds to their wickedness when they think it authorized by their God, whose interests, they are told, can make every action legitimate. Is religion in danger? The most civilized people immediately becomes true savages, and think nothing forbidden. The more cruel they are, the more agreeable they suppose they are to their God, whose cause they imagine cannot be supported with too much warmth. All religions have authorized innumerable crimes. The Jews, intoxicated with the promises of their God, arrogated the rights of exterminating whole nations. Relying on the oracles of their God, the Romans conquered and ravaged the world. The Arabians, encouraged by their divine prophet, carried fire and sword among the Christians and the idolaters. The Christians, under pretext of extending their holy religion, have often deluged both hemispheres in blood. In all events favorable to their own interest, which they always call the cause of God, priests show us the finger of God. According to these principles, the devout have the happiness to see the finger of God in revolts, revolutions, massacres, regicides, crimes, prostitutions, horrors, and if these things contribute ever so little to the triumph of religion, we are told, that God uses all sorts of means to attain his ends. Is anything more capable of effacing every idea of morality from the minds of men, than to inform them that their God, so powerful and perfect, is often forced to make use of criminal actions in order to accomplish his designs? 159. The argument that evils attributed to religion are faults of men. No sooner do we complain of the extravagancies and evils, which religion has so often caused upon the earth, than we are reminded that these excesses are not owing to religion, but that they are the sad effects of the passions of men. But I would ask, what has let loose these passions? It is evidently religion. It is zeal that renders men inhuman, and serves to conceal the greatest atrocities. Do not these disorders then prove, that religion, far from restraining the passions of men, only covers them with a veil, which sanctifies them, and that nothing would be more useful than to tear away this sacred veil of which men often make such a terrible use? What horrors would be banished from society, if the wicked were deprived of so plausible a pretext for disturbing it? Instead of being angels of peace among men, priests have been demons of discord. They have pretended to receive from heaven the right of being quarrelsome, turbulent, and rebellious. Do not the ministers of the Lord think themselves aggrieved, and pretend that the divine majesty is offended, whenever sovereigns have the temerity to prevent them from doing evil? Priests are like the spiteful woman who cried, "Fire! Murder! Assassination!" while her husband held her hands to prevent her from striking him. 160. Religion is incompatible with morality. Notwithstanding the bloody tragedies, which religion often acts, it is insisted, that without religion there can be no morality. If we judge theological opinions by their effects, we may confidently assert, that all morality is perfectly incompatible with men's religious opinions. "Imitate God!" exclaim the pious. But what would be our morality, should we imitate this God? And what God ought we to imitate? The God of the Deist? But even this God cannot serve us as a very constant model of goodness. If he is the author of all things, he is the author both of good and evil. If he is the author of order, he is also the author of disorder, which could not take place without his permission. If he produces, he destroys. If he gives life, he takes it away. If he grants abundance, riches, prosperity, and peace, he permits or sends scarcity, poverty, calamities, and wars. How then can we receive as a model of permanent beneficence the God of deism or natural religion, whose favorable dispositions are every instant contradicted by all the effects we behold? Morality must have a basis less tottering than the example of a God, whose conduct varies, and who cannot be called good, unless we obstinately shut our eyes against the evil which he causes or permits in this world. Shall we imitate the beneficent mighty Jupiter of heathen antiquity? To imitate such a God is to admit as a model a rebellious son, who ravishes the throne from his father. It is to imitate a debauchee, an adulterer, one guilty of incest and of base passions, at whose conduct every reasonable mortal would blush. What would have been the condition of men under paganism, had they imagined, like Plato, that virtue consisted in imitating the gods? Must we imitate the God of the Jews? Shall we find in Jehovah a model for our conduct? This is a truly savage God, made for a stupid, cruel, and immoral people. He is always furious, breathes nothing but vengeance, commands carnage, theft, and unsociability. The conduct of this God cannot serve as a model to that of an honest man, and can be imitated only by a chief of robbers. Shall we then imitate the Jesus of the Christians? Does this God, who died to appease the implacable fury of his Father, furnish us an example which men ought to follow? Alas! We shall see in him only a god, or rather a fanatic, a misanthrope, who, himself plunged in wretchedness and preaching to wretches, will advise them to be poor, to combat with and stifle nature, to hate pleasure, seek grief, and detest themselves. He will tell them to leave father, mother, relations, friends, etc., to follow him. Fine morality, you say. It is undoubtedly admirable. It must be divine, for it is impracticable to men. But is not such sublime morality calculated to render virtue odious? According to the so much boasted morality of the man-God of the Christians, a disciple of his in this world must be like Tantalus, tormented with a burning thirst, which he is not allowed to quench. Does not such morality give us a wonderful idea of the Author of nature? If, as we are assured, he has created all things for his creatures, by what strange whim does he forbid them the use of the goods he has created for them? Is pleasure, then, which man continually desires, only a snare which God has maliciously laid to surprise his weakness? End of section 15. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 16 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul-Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 16, parts 161 through 170. 161. The morality of the gospel is impracticable. The followers of Christ would have us regard as a miracle the establishment of their religion, which is totally repugnant to nature, opposite to all the propensities of the heart, and inimical to sensual pleasures. But the austerity of a doctrine renders it the more marvellous in the eyes of the vulgar. The same disposition which respects inconceivable mysteries as divine and supernatural, admires as divine and supernatural a morality that is impracticable and beyond the powers of man. To admire a system of morality and to put it in practice are two very different things. All Christians admire and extol the morality of the gospel which they do not practice. The whole world is more or less infected with the religious morality, founded upon the opinion that to please the divinity it is absolutely necessary to render ourselves unhappy upon earth. In all parts of our globe we see penitents, fakirs, and fanatics who seem to have profoundly studied the means of tormenting themselves in honor of a being whose goodness all agree in celebrating. Religion, by its essence, is an enemy to the joy and happiness of men. Blessed are the poor, blessed are they who weep, blessed are they who suffer, misery to those who are in abundance and joy. Such are the rare discoveries announced by Christianity. 162. A society of saints would be impossible. What is a saint in every religion? A man who prays and fasts, who torments himself and shuns the world, who, like an owl, delights only in solitude, abstains from all pleasure, and seems frightened of every object which may divert him from his fanatical meditations. Is this virtue? Is a being of this type kind to himself, or useful to others? Would not society be dissolved, and man return to a savage state, if every one were fool enough to be a saint? It is evident that the literal and rigorous practice of the divine morality of the Christians would prove the infallible ruin of nations. A Christian, aiming at perfection, ought to free his mind from whatever can divert it from heaven, his true country. Upon earth he sees nothing but temptations, snares, and rocks of perdition. He must fear science, as hurtful to faith. He must avoid industry, as a means of obtaining riches too fatal to salvation. He must renounce offices and honors, as capable of exciting his pride, and calling off his attention from the care of his soul. In a word, the sublime morality of Christ, were it practicable, would break all the bonds of society. A saint in society is as useless as a saint in the desert. His humor is morose, discontented, and often turbulent. His zeal sometimes obliges him in conscience to trouble society by opinions or dreams, which his vanity makes him consider as inspirations from on high. The annals of every religion are full of restless saints, intractable saints, and seditious saints, who have become famous by the ravages, with which, for the greater glory of God, they have desolated the universe. If saints, who live in retirement, are useless, those who live in the world are often very dangerous. The vanity of acting, the desire of appearing illustrious and peculiar in conduct, commonly constitute the distinguishing character of saints. Pride persuades them, that they are extraordinary men, far above human nature, beings much more perfect than others, favorites whom God regards with much more complacence than the rest of mortals. Humility in a saint is commonly only a more refined pride than that of the generality of men. Nothing but the most ridiculous vanity can induce man to wage continual war against his own nature. 163. Human nature is not depraved. A morality which contradicts the nature of man is not made for man. But, says you, the nature of man is depraved. In what consists this pretended depravity? In having passions? But are not passions essential to man? Is he not obliged to seek, desire, and love what is, or what he thinks is, conducive to his happiness? Is he not forced to fear and avoid what he judges disagreeable or fatal? Kindle his passions for useful objects, connect his welfare with those objects, divert him, by sensible and known motives, from what may injure either him or others, and you will make him a reasonable and virtuous being. A man without passions would be equally indifferent to vice and to virtue. Holy doctors, you are always repeating to us that the nature of man is perverted. You exclaim, that all flesh has corrupted its way, that all the propensities of nature have become inordinate. In this case you accuse your God, who was either unable or unwilling that this nature should preserve its primitive perfection. If this nature is corrupted, why has not God repaired it? The Christian immediately assures us, that human nature is repaired, that the death of his God has restored its integrity. How then, I would ask, do you pretend that human nature, notwithstanding the death of a God, is still depraved? Is then the death of your God wholly fruitless? What becomes of his omnipotence, and of his victory over the devil, if it is true that the devil still preserves the empire, which, according to you, he has always exercised in the world? According to Christian theology, death is the wages of sin. This opinion is conformable to that of some negro and savage nations, who imagine that the death of a man is always the supernatural effect of the anger of the gods. Christians firmly believe that Christ has delivered them from sin, though they see that in their religion, as in others, man is subject to death. To say that Jesus Christ has delivered us from sin, is it not to say that a judge has pardoned a criminal, while we see that he leaves him for execution? 164. Concerning the effect of Jesus Christ's mission. If shutting our eyes upon whatever passes in the world, we would credit the partisans of the Christian religion, we should believe that the coming of their divine Saviour produced the most wonderful and complete reform in the morals of nations. If we examine the morals of Christian nations, and listen to the clamours of their priests, we shall be forced to conclude, that Jesus Christ, their God, preached and died in vain. His omnipotent will still finds in men a resistance, over which he cannot or will not triumph. The morality of this divine teacher, which his disciples so much admire and so little practice, is followed in a whole century only by half a dozen obscure saints, and fanatics, and unknown monks, who alone will have the glory of shining in the celestial court, while all the rest of mortals, though redeemed by the blood of this God, will be the prey of eternal flames. 165. The remission of sins was invented for the interest of priests. When a man is strongly inclined to sin, he thinks very little about his God. Nay, more, whatever crimes he has committed, he always flatters himself, that this God will soften, in his favour, the rigour of his decrees. No mortal seriously believes that his conduct can damn him. Though he fears a terrible God, who often makes him tremble, yet, whenever he is strongly tempted, he yields, and he afterwards sees only the God of mercies, the idea of whom calms his apprehensions. If a man commits evil, he hopes he shall have time to reform, and promises to repent at a future day. In religious pharmacy there are infallible prescriptions to quiet consciences. Priests in every country possess sovereign secrets to disarm the anger of heaven. Yet if it be true that the Deity is appeased by prayers, offerings, sacrifices, and penances, it can no longer be said that religion is a check to the irregularities of men. They will first sin, and then seek the means to appease God. Every religion which expiates crime and promises a remission of them, if it restrains some persons, encourages the majority to commit evil. Notwithstanding his immutability, God, in every religion, is a true Proteus. His priests represent him at one time armed with severity, at another full of clemency and mildness; sometimes cruel and unmerciful, and sometimes easily melted by the sorrow and tears of sinners. Consequently, men see the divinity only on the side most conformable to their present interests. A God always angry would discourage his worshippers, or throw them into despair. Men must have a God, who is both irritable and placable. If his anger frightens some timorous souls, his clemency encourages the resolutely wicked, who depend upon recurring, sooner or later, to the means of accommodation. If the judgments of God terrify some faint-hearted pious persons, who by constitution and habit are not prone to evil, the treasures of divine mercy encourage the greatest criminals, who have reason to hope they participate therein equally with the others. 166. Who fear God? Most men seldom think of God, or at least bestow on him serious attention. The only ideas we can form of him are so devoid of object, and are at the same time so afflicting, that the only imaginations they can arrest are those of melancholy hypochondriacs, who do not constitute the majority of the inhabitants of this world. The vulgar have no conception of God; their weak brains are confused whenever they think of him. The man of business thinks only of his business, the courtier of his intrigues, men of fashion, women, and young people of their pleasures. Dissipation soon effaces in them all the fatiguing notions of religion. The ambitious man, the miser and the debauchee carefully avoid speculations too feeble to counterbalance their various passions. Who is awed by the idea of a God? A few enfeebled men, morose and disgusted with the world; a few, in whom the passions are already deadened by age, by infirmity, or by the strokes of fortune. Religion is a check to those alone who by their state of mind and body, or by fortuitous circumstances, have been already brought to reason. The fear of God hinders from sin only those who are not much inclined to it, or else those who are no longer able to commit it. To tell men that the Deity punishes crimes in this world is to advance an assertion which experience every moment contradicts. The worst of men are commonly the arbiters of the world, and are those whom fortune loads with her favours. To refer us to another life, in order to convince us of the judgments of God, is to refer us to conjectures in order to destroy facts which cannot be doubted. 167. Hell is an absurd invention. Nobody thinks of the life to come, when he is strongly smitten with the objects he finds here below. In the eyes of a passionate lover, the presence of his mistress extinguishes the flames of hell, and her charms efface all the pleasures of paradise. Woman, you leave, say you, your lover for your God. This is either because your lover is no longer the same in your eyes, or because he leaves you. Nothing is more common than to see ambitious, perverse, corrupt, and immoral men, who have some ideas of religion, and sometimes appear even zealous for its interest. If they do not practice it at present, they hope to in the future. They lay it up as a remedy which will be necessary to salve the conscience for the evil they intend to commit. Besides, the party of devotees and priests being very numerous, active, and powerful, is it not astonishing that rogues and knaves seek its support to attain their ends? It will undoubtedly be said, that many honest people are sincerely religious, and that without profit, but is uprightness of heart always accompanied with knowledge? It is urged that many learned men, many men of genius, have been strongly attached to religion. This proves that men of genius may have prejudices, be pusillanimous, and have an imagination, which misleads them and prevents them from examining subjects coolly. Pascal proves nothing in favour of religion, unless that a man of genius may be foolish on some subjects, and is but a child, when he is weak enough to listen to his prejudices. Pascal himself tells us that the mind may be strong and contracted, enlarged and weak. He previously observes that a man may have a sound mind, and not understand every subject equally well, for there are some, who, having a sound judgment in a certain order of things, are bewildered in others. 168. The bad foundation of religious morals. What is virtue according to theology? It is, we are told, the conformity of the actions of man to the will of God. But what is God? A being of whom nobody has the least conception, and whom every one consequently modifies in his own way. What is the will of God? It is what men who have seen God, or whom God has inspired, have declared to be the will of God. Who are those who have seen God? They are either fanatics, or rogues, or ambitious men, whom we cannot believe. To found morality upon a God, whom every man paints to himself differently, composes in his way, and arranges according to his own temperament and interest, is evidently to found morality upon the caprice and imagination of men. It is to found it upon the whims of a sect, a faction, a party, who believe they have the advantage to adore a true God to the exclusion of all others. To establish morality or the duties of man upon the divine will, is to found it upon the will, the reveries, and the interests of those who make God speak without ever fearing that he will contradict them. In every religion, priests alone have a right to decide what is pleasing or displeasing to their God, and we are certain they will always decide that it is what pleases or displeases themselves. The dogmas, the ceremonies, the morals, and the virtues prescribed by every religion are visibly calculated only to extend the power or augment the emoluments of the founders and ministers of these religions. The dogmas are obscure, inconceivable, frightful, and are therefore well calculated to bewilder the imagination, and to render the vulgar more obsequious to the will of those who wish to domineer over them. The ceremonies and practices procure the priests riches or respect. Religion consists in a submissive faith, which prohibits the exercise of reason, in a devout humility, which ensures priests the submission of their slaves, in an ardent zeal, when religion, that is, when the interest of these priests, is in danger. The only object of all religions is evidently the advantage of its ministers. 169. Christian Charity as preached and practiced by theologians. When we approach theologians with the barrenness of their divine virtues, they emphatically extol charity, that tender love of one's neighbor, which Christianity makes an essential duty of its disciples. But, alas! what becomes of this pretended charity, when we examine the conduct of the ministers of the Lord? Ask them, whether we must love or do good to our neighbor, if he be an impious man, a heretic, or an infidel, that is, if he do not think like them. Ask them whether we must tolerate opinions contrary to those of the religion they profess. Ask them whether the sovereign can show indulgence to those who are in error. Their charity instantly disappears, and the established clergy will tell you that the prince bears the sword only to support the cause of the Most High. They will tell you that through love of our neighbor we must prosecute, imprison, exile, and burn him. You will find no toleration except among a few priests, persecuted themselves, who will lay aside Christian charity the instant they have power to persecute in their turn. The Christian religion, in its origin, preached by beggars and miserable men, under the name of charity, strongly recommends alms. The religion of Mahomet also enjoins it as an indispensable duty. Nothing undoubtedly is more conformable to humanity than to succor the unfortunate, to clothe the naked, to extend the hand of beneficence to every one in distress. But would it not be more humane and charitable to prevent the source of misery and poverty? If religion, instead of deifying princes, had taught them to respect the property of their subjects, to be just, to exercise only their lawful rights, we should not be shocked by the sight of such a multitude of beggars. A rapacious, unjust, tyrannical government multiplies misery. Heavy taxes produce discouragement, sloth, and poverty, which in their turn beget robberies, assassinations, and crimes of every description. Had sovereigns more humanity, charity, and equity, their dominions would not be peopled by so many wretches, whose misery it becomes impossible to alleviate. Christian and Mahometan states are full of large hospitals, richly endowed, in which we admire the pious charity of the kings and sultans, who erected them. But would it not have been more humane to govern the people justly, to render them happy, to excite and favor industry and commerce, and to let men enjoy in safety the fruit of their labors, than to crush them under a despotic yoke, to impoverish them by foolish wars, to reduce them to beggary, in order that luxury may be satisfied, and then to erect splendid buildings, which can contain but a very small portion of those who have been rendered miserable? Religion has only deluded men. Instead of preventing evils, it always applies ineffectual remedies. The ministers of heaven have always known how to profit by the calamities of others. Public misery is their element. They have everywhere become administrators of the property of the poor, distributors of alms, depositaries of charitable donations; and thereby they have at all times extended and supported their power over the unhappy, who generally compose the most numerous, restless, and seditious part of society. Thus the greatest evils turn to the profit of the ministers of the Lord. Christian priests tell us, that the property they possess is the property of the poor, and that it is therefore sacred. Consequently they have eagerly accumulated lands, revenues, and treasures. Under colour of charity, spiritual guides have become extremely opulent, and in the face of impoverished nations enjoy wealth, which was destined solely for the unfortunate; while the latter, far from murmuring, applaud a pious generosity, which enriches the church, but rarely contributes to the relief of the poor. According to the principles of Christianity, poverty itself is a virtue. Indeed, it is the virtue, which sovereigns and priests oblige their slaves to observe most rigorously. With this idea, many pious Christians have of their own accord renounced riches, distributed their patrimony among the poor, and retired into deserts, there to live in voluntary indigence. But this enthusiasm, this supernatural taste for misery, has been soon forced to yield to nature. The successors of these volunteers in poverty sold to the devout people their prayers and their intercessions with the Deity. They became rich and powerful. Thus monks and hermits lived in indolence, and under colour of charity impudently devoured the substance of the poor. The species of poverty most esteemed by religion is poverty of mind. The fundamental virtue of every religion, most useful to its ministers, is faith. It consists in unbounded credulity, which admits, without inquiry, whatever the interpreters of the Deity are interested in making men believe. By the aid of this wonderful virtue, priests became the arbiters of right and wrong, of good and evil. They could easily cause the commission of crimes to advance their interest. Implicit faith has been the source of the greatest outrages that have been committed. 170. Confession, priestcraft's gold mine. He who first taught nations that, when we wrong man, we must ask pardon of God, appease him by presents, and offer him sacrifices, evidently destroyed the true principles of morality. According to such ideas, many persons imagine that they may obtain of the King of Heaven, as of kings of the earth, permission to be unjust and wicked, or may at least obtain pardon for the evil they may commit. Morality is founded upon the relations, wants, and constant interests of mankind. The relations which subsist between God and men are either perfectly unknown or imaginary. Religion, by associating God with man, has wisely weakened or destroyed the bonds which unite them. Mortals imagine they may injure one another with impunity, by making suitable satisfaction to the Almighty Being, who is supposed to have the right of remitting all offences committed against his creatures. Is anything better calculated to encourage the wicked, or harden them in crimes, than to persuade them that there exists an invisible being, who has a right to forgive acts of injustice, rapine, and outrage committed against society? By these destructive ideas, perverse men perpetrate the most horrid crimes, and believe they make reparation by imploring divine mercy. Their conscience is at rest, when a priest assures them that heaven is disarmed by a repentance, which, though sincere, is very useless to the world. In the mind of a devout man, God must be regarded more than his creatures. It is better to obey him than men. The interests of the celestial monarch must prevail over those of weak mortals. but the interests of heaven are obviously those of its ministers; whence it evidently follows, that in every religion, priests, under pretext of the interests of heaven or the glory of God, can dispense with the duties of human morality, when they clash with the duties which God has a right to impose. Besides, must not he, who has power to pardon crimes, have a right to encourage the commission of crimes? End of section 16. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 17 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul-Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 17, parts 171 through 181. 171. Supposition of the existence of a God unnecessary to morality. We are perpetually told that without a God there would be no moral obligation, that the people and even the sovereigns require a legislator powerful enough to constrain them. Moral constraint supposes a law, but this law arises from the eternal and necessary relations of things with one another, relations which have nothing common with the existence of a God. The rules of man's conduct are derived from his own nature, which he is capable of knowing, and not from the divine nature of which he has no idea. These rules constrain or oblige us, that is, we render ourselves estimable or contemptible, amiable or detestable, worthy of reward or of punishment, happy or unhappy, accordingly as we conform to or deviate from these rules. The law, which obliges man not to hurt himself, is founded upon the nature of a sensible being, who, in whatever way he came into this world, is forced by his actual essence to seek good and shun evil, to love pleasure and fear pain. The law, which obliges man not to injure, and even to do good to others, is founded upon the nature of sensible beings, living in society, whose essence compels them to despise those who are useless, and to detest those who oppose their felicity. Whether there exists a God or not, whether this God has spoken or not, the moral duties of men will always be the same, so long as they are sensible beings. Have men, then, need of a God whom they know not, of an invisible legislator, of a mysterious religion, and of chimerical fears, in order to learn that every excess evidently tends to destroy them, that to preserve health they must be temperate, that to gain the love of others it is necessary to do them good, that to do them evil is a sure means to incur their vengeance and hatred? Before the law there was no sin. Nothing is more false than this maxim. It suffices that man is what he is, or that he is a sensible being, in order to distinguish what gives him pleasure or displeasure. It suffices that one man knows that another man is a sensible being like himself, to perceive what is useful or hurtful to him. It suffices that man needs his fellow creature, in order to know that he must fear to excite sentiments unfavourable to himself. Thus the feeling and thinking being has only to feel and think, in order to discover what he must do for himself and others. I feel, and another feels like me. This is the foundation of all morals. 172. Supernatural morality are fatal to the public welfare. We can judge of the goodness of a system of morals only by its conformity to the nature of man. By this comparison we have a right to reject it, if contrary to the welfare of our species. Whoever has seriously meditated religion, whoever has carefully weighed its advantages and disadvantages, will be fully convinced that both are injurious to the interests of man, or directly opposite to his nature. To arms! The cause of your God is at stake! Heaven is outraged! The faith is in danger. Impiety, blasphemy, heresy. The magical power of these formidable words, the real value of which the people never understand, have at all times enabled priests to excite revolts, to dethrone kings, to kindle civil wars, and to lay waste. If we examine the important objects, which have produced so many ravages upon earth, it appears that either the foolish reveries and whimsical conjectures of some theologian, who did not understand himself, or else the pretensions of the clergy, have broken every social bond and deluged mankind with blood and tears. 173. The union of church and state is a calamity. The sovereigns of this world, by associating the divinity in the government of their dominions, by proclaiming themselves his vicegerents and representatives upon earth, and by acknowledging they hold their power from him, have necessarily constituted his ministers their own rivals or masters. Is it then astonishing that priests have often made kings feel the superiority of the celestial monarch? Have they not more than once convinced temporal princes that even the greatest power is compelled to yield to the spiritual power of opinion? Nothing is more difficult than to serve two masters, especially when they are not agreed upon what they require. The association of religion with politics necessarily introduced double legislation. The law of God, interpreted by his priests, was often repugnant to the law of the sovereign, or the interest of the state. When princes have firmness and are confident of the love of their subjects, the law of God is sometimes forced to yield to the wise intentions of the temporal sovereign. But generally the sovereign authority is obliged to give way to the divine authority, that is, to the interests of the clergy. Nothing is more dangerous to a prince than to encroach upon the authority of the church, that is, to attempt to reform abuses consecrated by religion. God is never more angry than when we touch the divine rights, privileges, possessions, or immunities of his priests. The metaphysical speculations of religious opinions of men influence their conduct only when they judge them conformable to their interest. Nothing proves this truth more clearly than the conduct of many princes with respect to the spiritual power, which they often resist. Ought not a sovereign, persuaded of the importance and rights of religion, to believe himself in conscience bound to receive respectfully the orders of its priests, and to regard them as the orders of the divinity? There was a time, when kings and people, more consistent in their conduct, were convinced of the rights of spiritual power, and becoming its slaves, yielded to it upon every occasion, and were but docile instruments in its hands. That happy time is past. By a strange inconsistency, the most devout monarchs are sometimes seen to oppose the enterprise of those whom they yet regard as the ministers of God. A sovereign, deeply religious, ought to remain prostrate at the feet of his ministers, and regard them as true sovereigns. Is there upon earth a power which has a right to put itself in competition with that of the Most High? 174. National religions are ruinous. Have princes, then, who imagine themselves interested in cherishing the prejudices of their subjects, seriously reflected upon the effects which have been, and may be again, produced by certain privileged demagogues, who have a right to speak at pleasure, and in the name of heaven to inflame the passions of millions of subjects? What ravages would not these sacred haranguers cause, if they should conspire, as they have so often done, to disturb the tranquillity of a state? To most nations nothing is more burdensome and ruinous than the worship of their gods. Not only do the ministers of these gods everywhere constitute the first order in the state, but they also enjoy the largest portion of the goods of society, and have a right to levy permanent taxes upon their fellow citizens. What real advantages, then, do these organs of the Most High procure the people for the immense profits extorted from their industry? In exchange for their riches and benefits, what do they give them but mysteries, hypotheses, ceremonies, subtle questions, and endless quarrels, which states are again compelled to pay with blood? 175. Religion paralyzes morality. Religion, though said to be the firmest prop of morality, evidently destroys its true springs in order to substitute imaginary ones, inconceivable chimeras, which, being obviously contrary to reason, nobody firmly believes. All nations declare that they firmly believe in a God, who rewards and punishes. All say they are persuaded of the existence of hell and paradise. Yet do these ideas render men better or counteract the most trifling interests? Every one assures us that he trembles at the judgments of God, yet every one follows his passions, when he thinks himself sure of escaping the judgments of man. The fear of invisible powers is seldom so strong as the fear of visible ones. Unknown or remote punishments strike the multitude far less forcibly than the sight of the gallows. Few courtiers fear the anger of their God so much as the displeasure of their master. A pension, a title, or a riband suffices to efface the remembrance both of the torments of hell and of the pleasures of the celestial court. The caresses of a woman repeatedly prevail over the menaces of the Most High. A jest, a stroke of ridicule, a witticism, make more impression upon the man of the world than all the grave notions of his religion. Are we not assured that a true repentance is enough to appease the Deity? Yet we do not see this true repentance is very sincere. At least it is rare to see noted thieves, even at the point of death, restore goods which they have unjustly acquired. Men are undoubtedly persuaded that they shall fit themselves for eternal fire, if they cannot insure themselves against it. But some useful compacts may be made with heaven. By giving the Church a part of his fortune, almost every devout rogue may die in peace, without concerning himself in what he gained his riches. 176. Fatal consequences of devotion. By the confession of the warmest defenders of religion and of its utility, nothing is more rare than sincere conversions, and, we might add, nothing more unprofitable to society. Men are not disgusted with the world until the world is disgusted with them. If the devout have the talent of pleasing God and his priests, they have seldom that of being agreeable or useful to society. To a devotee, religion is a veil, which covers all passions, pride, ill humour, anger, revenge, impatience, and rancour. Devotion arrogates a tyrannical superiority, which banishes gentleness, indulgence, and gaiety. It authorizes people to censure their neighbors, to reprove and revile the profane for the greater glory of God. It is very common to be devout, and at the same time destitute of every virtue and quality necessary to social life. 177. The idea of a future life is not consoling to man. It is asserted that the dogma of another life is of the utmost importance to peace and happiness, that without it men would be destitute of motives to do good. What need is there of terrors and fables to make man sensible how he ought to conduct himself? Does not every one see that he has the greatest interest in meriting the approbation, esteem, and benevolence of the beings who surround him, and in abstaining from everything by which he may incur the censure, contempt, and resentment of society? However short an entertainment, a conversation, or visit, does not each desire to act his part decently, and agreeably to himself and others? If life is but a passage, let us strive to make it easy, which we cannot effect if we fail in regard to those who travel with us. Religion, occupied with its gloomy reveries, considers man merely as a pilgrim upon earth, and therefore supposes that, in order to travel the more securely, he must forsake company, and deprive himself of pleasure and amusements, which might console him for the tediousness and fatigue of the journey. A stoical and morose philosopher sometimes gives us advice as irrational as that of religion. But a more rational philosophy invites us to spread flowers upon the way of life, to dispel melancholy and banish terrors, to connect our interest with that of our fellow travellers, and by gaiety and lawful pleasures, to divert our attention from difficulties and accidents, to which we are often exposed. It teaches us that, to travel agreeably, we should abstain from what might be injurious to ourselves, and carefully shun what might render us odious to our associates. 178. An atheist is fully as conscientious as a religious man. It is asked, what motives an atheist can have to do good? The motive to please himself and his fellow creatures, to live happily and peaceably, to gain the affection and esteem of men. Can he, who fears not the gods, fear anything? He can fear men, he can fear contempt, dishonor, the punishment of the laws. In short, he can fear himself, and the remorse felt by all those who are conscious of having incurred or merited the hatred of their fellow creatures. Conscience is the internal testimony, which we bear to ourselves, of having acted so as to merit the esteem or blame of the beings with whom we live, and it is founded upon the clear knowledge we have of men, and of the sentiments which our actions must produce in them. The conscience of the religious man consists in imagining that he has pleased or displeased his God, of whom he has no idea, and whose obscure and doubtful intentions are explained to him only by men of doubtful veracity, who, like him, are utterly unacquainted with the essence of the Deity, and are little agreed upon what can please or displease him. In a word, the conscience of the credulous is directed by men, who have themselves an erroneous conscience, or whose interest stifles knowledge. Can an atheist have a conscience? What are his motives to abstain from hidden vices and secret crimes of which other men are ignorant, and which are beyond the reach of laws? He may be assured by constant experience, that there is no vice, which, by the nature of things, does not punish itself. Would he preserve this life? He will avoid every excess that may impair his health. He will not wish to lead a languishing life, which would render him a burden to himself and others. As for secret crimes, he will abstain from them, for fear he shall be forced to blush at himself, from whom he cannot flee. If he has any reason, he will know the value of the esteem which an honest man ought to have for himself. He will see, that unforeseen circumstances may unveil the conduct which he feels interested in concealing from others. The other world furnishes no motives for doing good to him who finds none on earth. 179. An atheistical king far preferable to a religious king. The speculative atheist, says the theist, may be an honest man, but his writings will make political atheists. Princes and ministers, no longer restrained by the fear of God, will abandon themselves without scruple to the most horrid excesses. But, however great the depravity of an atheist upon the throne, can it be stronger and more destructive than that of the many conquerors, tyrants, persecutors, ambitious men, and perverse courtiers, who, though not atheists, but often very religious and devout, have notwithstanding made humanity groan under the weight of their crimes? Can an atheistical prince do more harm to the world than a Louis XI, a Philip II, a Richelieu, who all united religion with crime? Nothing is more rare than atheistical princes, nothing more common than tyrants and ministers who are very wicked and very religious. 180. Philosophy produces morality. A man of reflection cannot be incapable of his duties, of discovering the relations subsisting between men, of meditating his own nature, of discerning his own wants, propensities, and desires, and of perceiving what he owes to beings who are necessary to his happiness. These reflections naturally lead him to a knowledge of the morality most essential to social beings. Dangerous passions seldom fall to the lot of a man who loves to commune with himself, to study, and to investigate the principles of things. The strongest passion of such a man will be to know truth, and his ambition to teach it to others. Philosophy cultivates the mind. On the score of morals and honesty, has not he who reflects and reasons evidently an advantage over him who makes it a principle never to reason? If ignorance is useful to priests, and to the oppressors of mankind, it is fatal to society. Man, void of knowledge, does not enjoy reason. Without reason and knowledge, he is a savage liable to commit crimes. Morality, or the science of duties, is acquired only by the study of man and of what is relative to man. He who does not reflect is unacquainted with true morality, and walks with precarious steps in the path of virtue. The less men reason, the more wicked they are. Savages, princes, nobles, and the dregs of the people are commonly the worst of men, because they reason the least. The devout man seldom reflects, and rarely reasons. He fears all enquiry, scrupulously follows authority, and often, through an error of conscience, makes it a sacred duty to commit evil. The atheist reasons. He consults experience, which he prefers to prejudice. If he reasons justly, his conscience is enlightened, he finds more real motives to do good than the bigot whose only motives are his fallacies, and who never listens to reason. Are not the motives of the atheist sufficiently powerful to counteract his passions? Is he blind enough to be unmindful of his true interest, which ought to restrain him? But he will be neither worse nor better than the numerous believers, who, notwithstanding religion and its sublime precepts, follow a conduct which religion condemns. Is a credulous assassin less to be feared than an assassin who believes nothing? Is a very devout tyrant less tyrannical than an undevout tyrant? 181. Religious opinions have little influence upon conduct. Nothing is more uncommon than to see men consistent. Their opinions never influence their conduct except when conformable to their temperaments, passions, and interests. Daily experience shows that religious opinions produce much evil and little good. They are hurtful, because they often favor the passions of tyrants, of ambitious men, of fanatics, and of priests. They are of no effect, because incapable of counterbalancing the present interests of the greater part of mankind. Religious principles are of no avail, when they act in opposition to ardent desires. Though not unbelievers, men then conduct themselves as if they believed nothing. We shall always be liable to err, when we judge of the opinions of men by their conduct, or of their conduct by their opinions. A religious man, notwithstanding the unsociable principles of a sanguinary religion, will sometimes, by a happy inconsistency, Be humane, tolerant, and moderate. The principles of his religion do not then agree with the gentleness of his character. Libertines, debauchees, hypocrites, adulterers, and rogues often appear to have the best ideas upon morals. Why do they not reduce them to practice? Because their temperament, their interest, and their habits do not accord with their sublime theories. The rigid principles of Christian morality, which many people regard as divine, have but little influence upon the conduct of those who preach them to others. Do they not daily tell us to do what they preach and not what they practice? The partisans of religion often denote an infidel by the word libertine. It is possible that many unbelievers may have loose morals, which is owing to their temperament and not to their opinions. But how does their conduct affect their opinions? Cannot then an immoral man be a good physician, architect, geometrician, logician, or metaphysician? A man of irreproachable conduct may be extremely deficient in knowledge and reason. In quest of truth, it little concerns us from whom it comes. Let us not judge men by their opinions, nor opinions by men. Let us judge men by their conduct, and their opinions by their conformity with experience and reason, and by their utility to mankind. End of section 17. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 18 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul-Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 18, parts 182 through 190. 182. Reason leads man to atheism. Every man who reasons soon becomes an unbeliever, for reason shows that theology is nothing but a tissue of chimeras, that religion is contrary to every principle of good sense, that it tinctures all human knowledge with falsity. The sensible man is an unbeliever, because he sees that, far from making men happier, religion is the chief source of the greatest disorders and the permanent calamities with which man is afflicted. The man who seeks his own welfare and tranquillity examines and throws aside religion, because he thinks it no less troublesome than useless to spend his life in trembling before phantoms fit to impose only upon silly women or children. If licentiousness, which reasons but little, sometimes leads to irreligion, the man of pure morals may have very good motives for examining his religion and banishing it from his mind. Religious terrors, too weak to impose upon the wicked in whom vice is deeply rooted, afflict, torment, and overwhelm restless imaginations. Courageous and vigorous minds soon shake off the unsupportable yoke. But those who are weak and timorous languish under it during life, and as they grow old their fears increase. Priests have represented God as so malicious, austere, and terrible a being, that most men would cordially wish that there was no God. It is impossible to be happy while always trembling. Ye devout, you adore a terrible God, but you hate him. You would be glad if he did not exist. Can we refrain from desiring the absence or destruction of a master, the idea of whom destroys our happiness? The black colors in which priests paint the divinity are truly shocking, and force us to hate and reject him. 183. Fear alone makes theists. If fear created the gods, fear supports their empire over the minds of mortals. So early are men accustomed to shudder at the mere name of the deity, that they regard him as a spectre, a hobgoblin, a bugbear, which torments and deprives them of courage even to wish relief from their fears. They apprehend that the invisible spectre will strike them the moment they cease to be afraid. Bigots are too much in fear of their God to love him sincerely. They serve him like slaves, who, unable to escape his power, resolve to flatter their master, and who, by dint of lying, at length persuade themselves that they in some measure love him. They make a virtue of necessity. The love of devotees for their God, and of slaves for their despots, is only a feigned homage. 184. Can we and ought we to love God? Christian divines have represented their God so terrible and so little worthy of love, that several of them have thought they must dispense with loving him, a blasphemy shocking to other divines, who were less ingenious. St. Thomas having maintained that we are obliged to love God as soon as we attain the use of reason, the Jesuit Sermond answered him, that is very soon. The Jesuit Vasquez assures us that it is enough to love God at the point of death. Hurtado, more rigid, says, we must love God every year. Enriquez is contented that we love him every 5 years. Sotas, every Sunday. Upon what are these opinions grounded? Asks Father Sermond, who adds that Suarez requires us to love God sometimes. But when? He leaves that to us. He knows nothing about it himself. Now, says he, who will be able to know that of which such a learned divine is ignorant? The same Jesuit Sermond further observes that God does not command us to love him with an affectionate love, nor does he promise us salvation upon condition that we give him our hearts. It is enough to obey and love him with an effective love by executing his orders. This is the only love we owe him, and he has not so much commanded us to love him as not to hate him. This doctrine appears heretical, impious, and abominable to the Jansenists, who, by the revolting severity they attribute to their God, make him far less amiable than the Jesuits, their adversaries. The latter, to gain adherents, paint God in colours capable of encouraging the most perverse of mortals. Thus nothing is more undecided with the Christians than the important question, whether they can, ought, or ought not to love God. Some of their spiritual guides maintain, that it is necessary to love him with all one's heart, notwithstanding all his severity. Others, like Father Daniel, think that an act of pure love to God is the most heroic act of Christian virtue, and almost beyond the reach of human weakness. The Jesuit Pintereau goes farther. He says, a deliverance from the grievous yoke of loving God is a privilege of the new covenant. 185. God and religion are proved to be absurdities. The character of the man always decides that of his God. Everybody makes one for himself, and like himself. The man of gaiety, involved in dissipation and pleasure, does not imagine that God can be stern and cross. He wants a good-natured God, with whom he can find reconciliation. The man of a rigid, morose, bilious, sour disposition must have a God like himself, a God of terror, and he regards as perverse those who admit a placable, indulgent God. As men are constituted, organized, and modified in a manner which cannot be precisely the same, how can they agree about a chimera which exists only in their brains? The cruel and endless disputes between the ministers of the Lord are not such as to attract the confidence of those who impartially consider them. How can we avoid complete infidelity upon viewing principles about which those who teach them to others are never agreed? How can we help doubting the existence of a God, of whom it is evident that even his ministers can only form very fluctuating ideas? How can we, in short, avoid totally rejecting a God, who is nothing but a shapeless heap of contradictions? How can we refer the matter to the decision of priests, who are perpetually at war, treating each other as impious and heretical, defaming and persecuting each other without mercy, for differing in the matter of understanding what they announce to the world? 186. The existence of God has not yet been demonstrated. The existence of a God is the basis of all religion. Nevertheless, this important truth has not as yet been demonstrated. I do not say so to convince unbelievers, but in a manner satisfactory to theologians themselves. Profound thinkers have at all times been occupied in inventing new proofs. What are the fruits of their meditations and arguments? They have left the subject in a worse condition. They have demonstrated nothing. They have almost always excited the clamours of their brethren, who have accused them of having poorly defended the best of causes. 187. Priests are more actuated by self-interest than unbelievers. The apologists of religion daily repeat, that the passions alone make unbelievers. Pride, they say, and the desire of signalizing themselves, make men atheists. They endeavour to efface from their minds the idea of God, only because they have reason to fear his terrible judgments. Whatever may be the motives which incline men to atheism, it is our business to examine whether their sentiments are founded in truth. No man acts without motives. Let us first examine the arguments and afterwards the motives. We shall see whether these motives are not legitimate, and more rational than those of many credulous bigots, who suffer themselves to be guided by masters little worthy of the confidence of men. You say then, priests of the Lord, that the passions make unbelievers, that they renounce religion only through interest, or because it contradicts their inordinate propensities. You assert that they attack your gods only because they fear their severity. But are you yourselves, in defending religion and its chimeras, truly exempt from passions and interests? Who reap advantages from this religion, for which priests display so much zeal? Priests. To whom does religion procure power, influence, riches, and honors? To priests. Who wage war, in every country, against reason, science, truth, and philosophy, and render them odious to sovereigns and people? Priests. Who profit by the ignorance and vain prejudices of men? Priests. Priests, you are rewarded, honored, and paid for deceiving mortals, and you cause those to be punished who undeceive them. The follies of men procure you benefices, offerings, and expiations, while those who announce the most useful truths are rewarded only with chains, gibbets, and funeral piles. Let the world judge between us. 188. Presumption and badness, more in priests than in atheists. Pride and vanity have been, and ever will be, inherent in the priesthood. Is anything more capable of rendering men haughty and vain than the pretence of exercising a power derived from heaven, of bearing a sacred character, of being the messengers and ministers of the Most High? Are not these dispositions perpetually nourished by the credulity of the people, the deference and respect of sovereigns, the immunities, privileges, and distinctions enjoyed by the clergy? In every country, the vulgar are much more devoted to their spiritual guides, whom they regard as divine, than to their temporal superiors, whom they consider as no more than ordinary men. The parson of a village acts a much more conspicuous part than the lord of the manor or the justice of the peace. Among the Christians, a priest thinks himself far above a king or an emperor. A Spanish grandee having spoken rather haughtily to a monk, the latter arrogantly said, "Learn to respect a man, who daily has your God in his hands, and your queen at his feet." Have priests, then, a right to accuse unbelievers of pride? Are they themselves remarkable for uncommon modesty or profound humility? Is it not evident that the desire of domineering over men is essential to their trade? If the ministers of the Lord were truly modest, should we see them so greedy of respect, so impatient of contradiction, so positive in their decisions, and so unmercifully revengeful to those whose opinions offend them? Has not science the modesty to acknowledge how difficult it is to discover truth? What other passion but ungovernable pride can make men so savage, revengeful, and void of indulgence and gentleness? What can be more presumptuous than to arm nations and deluge the world in blood, in order to establish or defend futile conjectures? You say, that presumption alone makes atheists. Inform them, then, what your God is. Teach them his essence. Speak of him intelligibly. Say something about him, which is reasonable, and not contradictory or impossible. If you are unable to satisfy them, if hitherto none of you have been able to demonstrate the existence of a God in a clear and convincing manner, if by your own confession his essence is completely veiled from you, as from the rest of mortals, forgive those, who cannot admit what they can neither understand nor make consistent with itself. Do not tax with presumption and vanity those who are sincere enough to confess their ignorance. Do not accuse of folly those who find themselves incapable of believing contradictions, and for once blush at exciting the hatred and fury of sovereigns and people against men, who think not like you concerning a being of whom you have no idea. Is anything more rash and extravagant than to reason concerning an object known to be inconceivable? You say, that the corruption of the heart produces atheism, that men shake off the yoke of the Deity only because they fear his formidable judgments. But why do you paint your God in colors so shocking that he becomes insupportable? Why does so powerful a God permit men to be so corrupt? How can we help endeavoring to shake off the yoke of a tyrant, who, able to do as he pleases with men, consents to their perversion, who hardens and blinds them, and refuses them his grace, that he may have the satisfaction to punish them eternally, for having been hardened and blinded, and for not having the grace which he refused? Theologians and priests must be very confident of the grace of heaven and a happy futurity, to refrain from detesting a master so capricious as the God they announce. A God, who damns eternally, is the most odious of beings that a human mind can invent. 189. Prejudices last but for a time. No man upon earth is truly interested in the support of error, which is forced sooner or later to yield to truth. The general good must at length open the eyes of mortals. The passions themselves sometimes contribute to break the chains of prejudices. Did not the passions of sovereigns, centuries ago, annihilate in some countries of Europe the tyrannical power, which a too haughty pontiff once exercised over all princes of his sect? In consequence of the progress of political science, the clergy were then stripped of immense riches, which credulity had accumulated upon them. Ought not this memorable example to convince priests that prejudices triumph but for a time, and that truth alone can ensure solid happiness? By caressing sovereigns, by fabricating divine rights for them, by deifying them, and by abandoning the people, bound hand and foot, to their will, the ministers of the Most High must see, that they are laboring to make them tyrants. Have they not reason to apprehend, that the gigantic idols, which they raise to the clouds, will one day crush them by their enormous weight? Do not 1,000 examples remind them that these tyrants, after preying upon the people, may prey upon them in their turn? We will respect priests when they become sensible men. Let them, if they please, use the authority of heaven to frighten those princes who are continually desolating the earth, but let them no more adjudge to them the horrid right of being unjust with impunity. Let them acknowledge that no man is interested in living under tyranny, and let them teach sovereigns that they themselves are not interested in exercising a despotism which, by rendering them odious, exposes them to danger, and detracts from their power and greatness. Finally, let priests and kings become so far enlightened as to acknowledge that no power is secure which is not founded upon truth, reason, and equity. 190. What if priests the apostles of reason? By waging war against reason, which they ought to have protected and developed, the ministers of the gods evidently act against their own interest. What power, influence, and respect might they not have gained among the wisest of men? What gratitude would they not have excited in the people, if, instead of wasting their time about their vain disputes, they had applied themselves to really useful science, and investigated the true principles of philosophy, government, and morals? Who would dare to reproach a body with its opulence or influence, if the members dedicating themselves to the public good employed their leisure in study, and exercised their authority in enlightening the minds both of sovereigns and subjects? Priests, forsake your chimeras, your unintelligible dogmas, your contemptible quarrels. Banish those phantoms which could be useful only in the infancy of nations. Assume, at length, the language of reason. Instead of exciting persecution, instead of entertaining the people with silly disputes, instead of preaching useless and fanatical dogmas, preach human and social morality. Preach virtues really useful to the world. Become the apostles of reason, the defenders of liberty, and the reformers of abuses. End of section 18. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 19 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul-Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 19, parts 191 through 200. 191. If philosophy were substituted for religion. Philosophers have everywhere taken upon themselves a part which seemed destined to the ministers of religion. The hatred of the latter for philosophy was only a jealousy of trade. But instead of endeavoring to injure and decry one another, all men of good sense should unite their efforts to combat error, seek truth, and especially to put to flight the prejudices that are equally injurious to sovereigns and subjects, and of which the abettors themselves sooner or later become the victims. In the hands of an enlightened government, the priests would become the most useful of the citizens. Already richly paid by the state, and free from the care of providing for their own subsistence, how could they be better employed than in qualifying themselves for the instruction of others? Would not their minds be better satisfied with discovering luminous truths than in wandering through the thick darkness of error? Would it be more difficult to discern the clear principles of morality than the imaginary principles of a divine and theological morality? Would men of ordinary capacities find it as difficult to fix in their heads the simple notions of their duties, as to load their memories with mysteries, unintelligible words, and obscure definitions, of which they can never form a clear idea? What time and pains are lost in learning and teaching things which are not of the least real utility? What resources for the encouragement of the sciences, the advancement of knowledge, and the education of youth, well-disposed sovereigns might find in the many monasteries, which in several countries live upon the people without in the slightest degree profiting them. But superstition, jealous of its exclusive empire, seems resolved to form only useless beings. To what advantage might we not turn a multitude of Cenobites of both sexes, who, in many countries, are amply endowed for doing nothing? Instead of overwhelming them with fasting and austerities, instead of barren contemplations, mechanical prayers, and trifling ceremonies, why should we not excite in them a salutary emulation, which may incline them to seek the means, not of being dead to the world, but of being useful to it? Instead of filling the youthful minds of their pupils with fables, sterile dogmas, and puerilities, why are not priests obliged or invited to teach them truths, and to render them useful citizens of their country? Under the present system, men are only useful to the clergy who blind them, and to the tyrants who fleece them. 192. Recantation of an unbeliever at the point of death proves nothing. The partisans of credulity often accuse unbelievers of insincerity, because they sometimes waver in their principles, alter their minds in sickness, and retract at death. When the body is disordered, the faculty of reasoning is commonly disordered with it. At the approach of death, man, weak and decayed, is sometimes himself sensible that reason abandons him, and that prejudice returns. There are some diseases which tend to weaken the brain, to create despondency and pusillanimity, and there are others which destroy the body, but do not disturb the reason. At any rate, an unbeliever who recants in sickness is not more extraordinary than a devotee who neglects in health the duties which his religion explicitly enjoins. Ministers of religion openly contradict in their daily conduct the rigorous principles they teach to others, in consequence of which unbelievers, in their turn, may justly accuse them of insincerity. Is it easy to find many prelates humble, generous, void of ambition, enemies of pomp and grandeur, and friends of poverty? In short, is the conduct of Christian ministers conformable to the austere morality of Christ, their God, and their model? 193. It is not true that atheism breaks the bonds of society. Atheism, it is said, breaks all the ties of society. Without the belief of a God, what will become of the sacredness of oaths? How shall we oblige a man to speak the truth, who cannot seriously call the Deity to witness what he says? But does an oath strengthen our obligation to fulfill the engagements contracted? Will he, who is not fearful of lying, be less fearful of perjury? He, who is base enough to break his word, or unjust enough to violate his engagements, in contempt of the esteem of men, will not be more faithful therein for having called all the gods to witness his oaths. Those who disregard the judgments of men, will soon disregard the judgments of God. Are not princes of all men the most ready to swear, and the most ready to violate their oaths? 194. Refutation of the opinion that religion necessary for the vulgar. The vulgar, it is repeatedly said, must have a religion. If enlightened persons have no need of the restraint of opinion, it is at least necessary to rude men, whose reason is uncultivated by education. But is it indeed a fact, that religion is a restraint upon the vulgar? Do we see that this religion preserves them from intemperance, drunkenness, brutality, violence, fraud, and every kind of excess? Could a people who have no idea of the Deity conduct themselves in a more detestable manner than these believing people, among whom we find dissipation and vices, the most unworthy of reasonable beings? Upon going out of the churches, do not the working classes and the populace plunge without fear into their ordinary irregularities, under the idea that the periodical homage, which they render to their God, authorizes them to follow without remorse their vicious habits and pernicious propensities? Finally, if the people are so low-minded and unreasonable, is not their stupidity chargeable to the negligence of their princes, who are wholly regardless of public education, or who even oppose the instruction of their subjects? Is not the want of reason in the people evidently the work of the priests, who, instead of instructing men in a rational morality, entertain them with fables, reveries, ceremonies, fallacies, and false virtues, which they think of the greatest importance? To the people, religion is but a vain display of ceremonies, to which they are attached by habit, which entertains their eyes, and produces a transient emotion in their torpid understandings, without influencing their conduct or reforming their morals. Even by the confession of the ministers of the altars, nothing is more rare than that internal and spiritual religion, which alone is capable of regulating the life of man and of triumphing over his evil propensities. In the most numerous and devout nation, are there many persons, who are equally capable of understanding the principles of their religious system, and who find them powerful enough to stifle their perverse inclinations? Many persons will say that any restraint whatever is better than none. They will maintain that, if religion awes not the greater part, it serves at least to restrain some individuals, who would otherwise without remorse abandon themselves to crime. Men ought undoubtedly to have a restraint, but not an imaginary one. Religion only frightens those whose imbecility of character has already prevented them from being formidable to their fellow citizens. An equitable government, severe laws, and sound morality have an equal power over all. At least, every person must believe in them, and perceive the danger of not conforming to them. 195. Logical systems are not adapted to the capacity of the vulgar. Perhaps it will be asked, whether atheism can be proper for the multitude. I answer, that any system, which requires discussion, is not made for the multitude. What purpose then can it serve to preach atheism? It may at least serve to convince all those who reason, that nothing is more extravagant than to fret one's self, and nothing more unjust than to vex others, for mere groundless conjectures. As for the vulgar who never reason, the arguments of an atheist are no more fit for them than the systems of a natural philosopher, the observations of an astronomer, the experiments of a chemist, the calculations of a geometrician, the researches of a physician, the plans of an architect, or the pleadings of a lawyer, who all labour for the people without their knowledge. Are the metaphysical reasonings and religious disputes, which have so long engrossed the time and attention of so many profound thinkers, better adapted to the generality of men than the reasoning of an atheist? Nay, as the principles of atheism are founded upon plain common sense, are they not more intelligible than those of a theology beset with difficulties, which even the persons of the greatest genius cannot explain? In every country the people have a religion, the principles of which they are totally ignorant, and which they follow from habit without any examination. Their priests alone are engaged in theology, which is too dense for vulgar heads. If the people should chance to lose this unknown theology, they mighty easily console themselves for the loss of a thing, not only perfectly useless, but also productive of dangerous commotions. It would be madness to write for the vulgar, or to attempt to cure their prejudices all at once. We write for those only who read and reason. The multitude read but little, and reason still less. Calm and rational persons will require new ideas, and knowledge will be gradually diffused. 196. On the futility and danger of theology. If theology is a branch of commerce profitable to theologians, it is evidently not only superfluous, but injurious to the rest of society. Self-interest will sooner or later open the eyes of men. Sovereigns and subjects will one day adopt the profound indifference and contempt, merited by a feudal system, which serves only to make men miserable. All persons will be sensible of the inutility of the many expensive ceremonies which contribute nothing to public felicity. Contemptible quarrels will cease to disturb the tranquillity of states, when we blush at having considered them important. Instead of Parliament meddling with the senseless combats of your clergy, instead of foolishly espousing their impertinent quarrels, and attempting to make your subjects adopt uniform opinions, strive to make them happy in this world. Respect their liberty and property, watch over their education, encourage them in their labors, reward their talents and virtues, repress licentiousness, and do not concern yourselves with their manner of thinking. Theological fables are useful only to tyrants and the ignorant. 197. On the evils produced by implicit faith. Does it then require an extraordinary effort of genius to comprehend that what is above the capacity of man is not made for him? That things supernatural are not made for natural beings? That impenetrable mysteries are not made for limited minds? If theologians are foolish enough to dispute upon objects, which they acknowledge to be unintelligible even to themselves, ought society to take any part in their silly quarrels? Must the blood of nations flow to enhance the conjectures of a few infatuated dreamers? If it is difficult to cure theologians of their madness, and the people of their prejudices, it is at least easy to prevent the extravagancies of one party, and the silliness of the other, from producing pernicious effects. Let every one be permitted to think as he pleases, but never let him be permitted to injure others for their manner of thinking. Were the rulers of nations more just and rational, theological opinions would not affect the public tranquillity, more than the disputes of natural philosophers, physicians, grammarians, and critics. It is tyranny which causes theological quarrels to be attended with serious consequences. Those who extol the importance and utility of religion ought to show us its happy effects, the advantages, for instance, which the disputes and abstract speculations of theology can be to porters, artisans, and labourers, and to the multitude of unfortunate women and corrupt servants with which great cities abound. All these beings are religious. They have what is called an implicit faith. Their parsons believe for them, and they stupidly adhere to the unknown belief of their guides. They go to hear sermons, and would think it a great crime to transgress any of the ordinances, to which, in childhood, they are taught to conform. But of what service to morals is all this? None at all. They have not the least idea of morality, and are even guilty of all the roguery, fraud, rapine, and excess that is out of the reach of law. The populace have no idea of their religion. What they call religion is nothing but a blind attachment to unknown opinions and mysterious practices. In fact, to deprive people of religion is to deprive them of nothing. By overthrowing their prejudices, we should only lessen or annihilate the dangerous confidence they put in interested guides, and should teach them to mistrust those who, under the pretext of religion, often lead them into fatal excesses. 198. On the evils produced by implicit faith. While pretending to instruct and enlighten men, religion in reality keeps them in ignorance, and stifles the desire of knowing the most interesting objects. The people have no other rule of conduct than what their priests are pleased to prescribe. Religion supplies the place of everything else. But being in itself essentially obscure, it is more proper to lead mortals astray, than to guide them in the path of science and happiness. Religion renders enigmatical all natural philosophy, morality, legislation, and politics. A man blinded by religious prejudices fears truth, whenever it clashes with his opinions. He cannot know his own nature, he cannot cultivate his reason, he cannot perform experiments. Everything concurs to render the people devout, but everything tends to prevent them from being humane, reasonable, and virtuous. Religion seems to have no other object than to stupefy the mind. Priests have been ever at war with genius and talent, because well-informed men perceive that superstition shackles the human mind, and would keep it in eternal infancy, occupied solely by fables and frightened by phantoms. Incapable of improvement itself, theology opposed insurmountable barriers to the progress of true knowledge. Its sole object is to keep nations and their rulers in the most profound ignorance of their duties, and of the real motives that should incline them to do good. It obscures morality, renders its principles arbitrary, and subjects it to the caprice of the gods, or of their ministers. It converts the art of governing men into a mysterious tyranny, which is the scourge of nations. It changes princes into unjust, licentious despots, and the people into ignorant slaves, who become corrupt in order to merit the favor of their masters. 199. All religions were established by impostors in days of ignorance. By tracing the history of the human mind, we shall be easily convinced that theology has cautiously guarded against its progress. It began by giving out fables as sacred truth. It produced poetry, which filled the imagination of men with its puerile fictions. It entertained them with its gods and their incredible deeds. In a word, religion has always treated men like children, whom it lulled to sleep with tales, which its ministers would have us still regard as incontestable truths. If the ministers of the gods have sometimes made useful discoveries, they have always been careful to give them a dogmatical tone, and envelop them in the shades of mystery. Pythagoras and Plato, in order to acquire some trifling knowledge, were obliged to court the favor of priests, to be initiated in their mysteries, and to undergo whatever trials they were pleased to impose. At this price, they were permitted to imbibe those exalted notions, still so bewitching to all those who admire only what is perfectly unintelligible. It was from Egyptian, Indian, and Chaldean priests, from the schools of these visionaries, professionally interested in bewildering human reason, that philosophy was obliged to borrow its first rudiments. Obscure and false in its principles, mixed with fictions and fables, and made only to dazzle the imagination, the progress of this philosophy was precarious, and its theories unintelligible. Instead of enlightening, it blighted the mind, and diverted it from objects truly useful. The theological speculations and mystical reveries of the ancients are still law in a great part of the philosophic world, and being adopted by modern theology, it is heresy to abandon them. They tell us of aerial beings, of spirits, angels, demons, genii, and other phantoms which are the object of their meditations, and serve as the basis of metaphysics, an abstract and futile science, which for thousands of years the greatest geniuses have vainly studied. Hypotheses, imagined by a few visionaries of Memphis and Babylon, constitute even now the foundations of a science whose obscurity makes it revered as marvelous and divine. The first legislators were priests. The first mythologists, poets, learned men, and physicians were priests. In their hands science became sacred and was withheld from the profane. They spoke only in allegories, emblems, enigmas, and ambiguous oracles, means well calculated to excite curiosity, and above all, to inspire the astonished vulgar with a holy respect for men, who when they were thought to be instructed by the gods, and capable of reading in the heavens the fate of the earth, boldly proclaimed themselves the oracles of the Deity. 200. All religions borrow from one another ridiculous ceremonies. The religions of ancient priests have only changed form. Although our modern theologians regard their predecessors as impostors, yet they have collected many scattered fragments of their religious systems. In modern religions we find, not only their metaphysical dogmas, which theology has merely clothed in a new dress, but also some remarkable remains of their superstitious practices, their magic, and their enchantments. Christians are still commanded to respect the remaining monuments of the legislators, priests, and prophets of the Hebrew religion, which had borrowed its strange practices from Egypt. Thus extravagancies, imagined by knaves or idolatrous visionaries, are still sacred among Christians. If we examine history, we shall find a striking resemblance among all religions. In all parts of the earth we see that religious notions periodically depress and elevate the people. The attention of man is everywhere engrossed, by rites often abominable, and by mysteries always formidable, which become the sole objects of meditation. The different superstitions borrow from one another their abstract reveries and ceremonies. Religions are in general mere unintelligible rhapsodies, combined by new teachers who use the materials of their predecessors, reserving the right of adding or retrenching whatever is not conformable to the present age. The religion of Egypt was evidently the basis of the religion of Moses, who banished the worship of idols. Moses was merely a schismatic Egyptian. Christianism is only reformed Judaism. Mohammedanism is composed of Judaism, Christianity, and the ancient religion of Arabia, etc. End of section 19. Recording by Roger Moline. Section 20 of Good Sense. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Good Sense by Paul-Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown. Section 20, parts 201 through 206. 201. Theology has always diverted philosophy from its right path. Theology, from the remotest antiquity to the present time, has had the exclusive privilege of directing philosophy. What assistance has been derived from its labors? It changed philosophy into an unintelligible jargon, calculated to render uncertain the clearest truths. It has converted the art of reasoning into a jargon of words. It has carried the human mind into the airy regions of metaphysics, and there employed it in vainly fathoming an obscure abyss. Instead of physical and simple causes, this transformed philosophy has substituted supernatural, or rather occult causes. It has explained phenomena difficult to be conceived by agents still more inconceivable. It has filled language with words, void of sense, incapable of accounting for things, better calculated to obscure than enlighten, and which seems invented expressly to discourage man, to guard him against the powers of his mind, to make him mistrust the principles of reason and evidence, and to raise an insurmountable barrier between him and truth. 202. Theology explains nothing. Were we to believe the partisans of religion, nothing could be explained without it. Nature would be a perpetual enigma, and man would be incapable of understanding himself. But what does this religion in reality explain? The more we examine it, the more we are convinced that its theological notions are fit only to confuse our ideas. They change everything into mystery. They explain difficult things by things that are impossible. Is it a satisfactory explanation of phenomena to attribute them to unknown agents, to invisible powers, to immaterial causes? Does the human mind receive much light by referring to the depths of the treasures of divine wisdom, to which, we are repeatedly told, it is vain to extend our rash inquiries? Can the divine nature, of which we have no conception, enable us to conceive the nature of man? Ask a Christian, what is the origin of the world? He will answer that God created it. What is God? He cannot tell. What is it to create? He knows not. What is the cause of pestilence, famine, wars, droughts, inundations, and earthquakes? The anger of God. What remedies can be applied to these calamities? Prayers, sacrifices, processions, offerings, and ceremonies are, it is said, the true means of disarming celestial fury. But why is heaven enraged? Because men are wicked. Why are men wicked? Because their nature is corrupt. What is the cause of this corruption? It is, says the theologian, because the first man, beguiled by the first woman, ate an apple which God had forbidden him to touch. Who beguiled this woman into such folly? The devil. Who made the devil? God. But why did God make this devil, destined to pervert mankind? This is unknown. It is a mystery which the Deity alone is acquainted with. It is now universally acknowledged that the earth turns around the sun. Centuries ago this opinion was blasphemy, as being irreconcilable with the sacred books which every Christian reveres as inspired by the Deity himself. Notwithstanding divine revelation, astronomers now depend rather upon evidence than upon the testimony of their inspired books. What is the hidden principle of the motions of the human body? The soul. What is a soul? A spirit. What is a spirit? A substance which has neither form, nor color, nor extension, nor parts. How can we form any idea of such a substance? How can it move a body? That is not known. It is a mystery. Have beasts souls? But do they not act, feel, and think in a manner very similar to man? Mere illusion! By what right do you deprive beasts of a soul, which you attribute to man, though you know nothing at all about it? Because the souls of beasts would embarrass our theologians, who are satisfied with the power of terrifying and damning the immaterial souls of men, and are not so much interested in damning those of beasts. Such are the puerile solutions which philosophy, always in the leading strings of theology, was obliged to invent, in order to explain the problems of the physical and moral world? 203. Theology has always fettered morality and retarded progress. How many evasions have been used, both in ancient and modern times, in order to avoid an engagement with the ministers of the gods, who have never been the tyrants of thought? How many hypotheses and shifts were such men as Descartes, Malebranche, and Leibniz forced to invent, in order to reconcile their discoveries with the fables and mistakes which religion had consecrated? In what guarded phrases have the greatest philosophers expressed themselves, even at the risk of being absurd, inconsistent, or unintelligible, whenever their ideas did not accord with the principles of theology? Priests have been always attentive to extinguish systems which opposed their interest. Theology was ever the bed of Procrustes, to be adapted to which the limbs of travellers, if too long were cut off, and if too short were lengthened. Can any sensible man, delighted with the sciences and attached to the welfare of his fellow creatures, reflect, without vexation and anguish, how many profound, laborious, and subtle brains have been for ages foolishly occupied in the study of absurdities? What a treasure of knowledge might have been diffused by many celebrated thinkers, if, instead of engaging in the impertinent disputes of vain theology, they had devoted their attention to intelligible objects really important to mankind? Half the efforts which religious opinions have cost genius, and half the wealth which frivolous forms of worship have cost nations, would have sufficed to instruct them perfectly in morality, politics, natural philosophy, medicine, agriculture, etc. Superstition generally absorbs the attention, admiration, and treasures of the people. Their religion costs them very dear, but they have neither knowledge, virtue, nor happiness for their money. 204. Theology has always fettered morality and retarded progress. Some ancient and modern philosophers have been bold enough to assume experience and reason for their guides, and to shake off the chains of superstition. Democritus, Epicurus, and other Greeks presumed to tear away the veil of prejudice, and to deliver philosophy from theological shackles. But their systems, too simple, too sensible, and too free from the marvellous, for imaginations enamoured with chimeras, were obliged to yield to the fabulous conjectures of such men as Plato and Socrates. Among the moderns, Hobbes, Spinoza, Bayle, etc., have followed the steps of Epicurus, but their doctrine has found very few followers, in a world still intoxicated with fables to listen to reason. In every age it has been dangerous to depart from prejudices. Discoveries of every kind have been prohibited. All that enlightened men could do was to speak ambiguously, hence they often confounded falsehood with truth. Several had a double doctrine, one public and the other secret. The key of the latter being lost, their true sentiments have often become unintelligible and consequently useless. How could modern philosophers, who, under pain of cruel persecution, were commanded to renounce reason, and to subject it to faith, that is, to the authority of priests, how, I say, could men, thus bound, give free scope to their genius, improve reason, and accelerate the progress of the human mind? It was with fear and trembling that even the greatest men obtained a glimpse of truth. Rarely had they the courage to announce it, and those who did were terribly punished. With religion, it has ever been unlawful to think, or to combat the prejudices of which man is everywhere the victim and the dupe. 205. Religion is an extravagance and a calamity. Every man, sufficiently intrepid to announce truths to the world, is sure of incurring the hatred of the ministers of religion, who loudly call to their aid secular powers, and want the assistance of laws to support both their arguments and their gods. Their clamors expose too evidently the weakness of their cause. None call for aid but those who feel distressed. In religion, man is not permitted to err. In general, those who err are pitied, and some kindness is shown to persons who discover new truths. But, when religion is thought to be interested either in the errors or the discoveries, a holy zeal is kindled, the populace become frantic, and nations are in an uproar. Can anything be more afflicting than to see public and private felicity depending upon a feudal system, which is destitute of principles, founded only on a distempered imagination, and incapable of presenting anything but words void of sense? In what consists the so much boasted utility of a religion, which nobody can comprehend, which continually torments those who are weak enough to meddle with it, which is incapable of rendering men better, and which often makes them consider it meritorious to be unjust and wicked? Is there a folly more deplorable, and more justly to be combated than that, which, far from doing any service to the human race, only makes them blind, delirious, and miserable, by depriving them of truth, the sole cure for their wretchedness? 206. Religion prevents us from seeing the true causes of misfortunes. Religion has ever filled the mind of man with darkness, and kept him in ignorance of his real duties and true interests. It is only by dispelling the clouds and phantoms of religion that we shall discover truth, reason, and morality. Religion diverts us from the causes of evils, and from the remedies which nature prescribes. Far from curing, it only aggravates, multiplies, and perpetuates them. Let us observe with the celebrated Lord Bolingbroke, that theology is the box of Pandora, and if it is impossible to shut it, it is at least useful to inform men that this fatal box is open. The End. End of section 20. Recording by Roger Moline. End of Good Sense Without God, or Free Thoughts Opposed to Supernatural Ideas, by Paul Henri Thiry, Baron d'Holbach. Translator unknown.